Hello, my friend. I'm glad you found your way back to me tonight. And if this happens to be the very first evening we're spending together, well, welcome in. Get yourself settled in whatever way feels most comfortable to you. Now, before we step any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked into a mirror late at night and wondered what your own reflection might have looked like 150 years earlier? Tonight we're going somewhere quiet. Somewhere lit only by candlelight, where a young woman is sitting in front of a looking glass, and where every single strand of her hair is about to tell you something about the entire world she lives in. Because in 1873, in a small country house tucked away in the English countryside, a woman's hair was never simply hair. It was her reputation, her modesty, her whole story quietly pinned up and hidden in plain sight. Before we step further into her world, let's take one small moment together. If a story like this ever finds its place in your evening, a quiet tap on that subscribe button, or a like would mean far more than you probably realize. And if you feel like leaving a comment while you listen, I would love that too. Tell me where you are tonight or what time it is where you're settling in. I always enjoy looking through those little details later. Now let's turn the lights down low. Maybe let a fan hum softly somewhere nearby. Wrap yourself up warm and let's step quietly into her bedroom. On a cold October morning in 1873, the room was still half in shadow. Outside, a thin autumn fog pressed against the window glass, and somewhere below a fire had only just been lit in the breakfast room. The house itself was nothing grand, just a modest country home belonging to a solicitor and his family. The kind of household that sat comfortably somewhere between wealth and want, with enough means for one lady's maid, but not nearly enough for a full staff below stairs. But here in the small dressing room tucked at the back of the house, one candle was already burning beside a mirror, and a young woman named Charlotte sat very still in front of it. She was 24 years old. Her hair, unpinned for the moment, fell all the way past her waist, thick, dark, and slightly damp near the roots from the night's rest. Behind her stood Agnes, her lady's maid, a brush already moving in slow, even strokes starting at the scalp and travelling all the way down to the very ends. Neither of them spoke much. This was not unusual. Some mornings simply passed this way. Just the soft sound of bristles moving through hair, and the occasional crackle from the small fire burning in the corner of the room. On the little table beside the mirror sat a set of tortoiseshell combs, a small dish of hairpins, and a jar of scented pomade Charlotte's mother had passed down to her, the label long since worn away by years of careful hands. To anyone watching from outside this house, this scene might have looked like nothing more than a young woman being groomed for her day. A simple, quiet routine. But if you had lived in England in 1873, if you had grown up inside this same private ritual, you would have understood that something far larger was happening in that small room, because in Charlotte's world a woman's hair was never simply her own. Here is something rather curious. In a certain old book of scripture, one that almost every educated household in England kept somewhere within arm's reach, there was a single sentence about a woman's hair. It said in simple terms that a woman's hair had been given to her almost like a covering, a kind of glory. And by the middle of the 19th century, that one small idea had grown roots so deep into English society that hardly anyone thought to question it anymore. Writers of etiquette books at the time had a favourite phrase for it. They called a woman's hair her crowning glory, not her face, not her figure, her hair specifically above everything else. Ladies' magazines of the era printed page after page of advice on the subject. How to grow it, how to arrange it, how to keep it healthy and thick and shining. A woman could be admired for her kindness, her wit, or her singing voice, and still be judged quietly and immediately by the state of her hair the moment she entered a room. And once you understand that single phrase, crowning glory, an entire world of small, strange rules suddenly starts to make a great deal more sense. Let me take you back a little further to a morning 8 years earlier than this one. Charlotte was 16 years old, then standing in almost this exact spot, except her hair back in those days still hung loose down her back in a single simple braid. the same way it had since she was a small girl. That was the mark of childhood in Victorian England. Young girls wore their hair down or gathered into one plain braid, openly without much thought given to it at all. Nobody scolded a child for showing her hair to the world, but there came a particular morning, usually somewhere between the ages of 16 and 18, when a mother and older sister, or in Charlotte's case her own aunt, would sit a girl down and say some version of the very same sentence. "It is time to put your hair up." Charlotte still remembered how strange those words felt that morning. Her aunt had smiled at her gently in the mirror, the way you smile at someone stepping onto ground they cannot walk back from. There had been no church service for it, no gift, no formal announcement to the neighbours. Just a chair, a brush, and an aunt's steady hands twisting Charlotte's hair up off her shoulders for what would turn out to be the very last time it hung loose, in front of anyone beyond her own family. She remembered feeling older within a single hour, and a little unsure whether she liked the woman now looking back at her from the glass. Those 5 words, "It is time to put your hair up," carried far more weight than a simple change in hairstyle. They mark the moment a girl stepped out of childhood and into womanhood, ready or not. From that morning forward, her hair would be pinned, coiled, and carefully arranged nearly every single day, for the remainder of her life. It would rarely, if ever, be seen loose again in front of anyone outside her own household. Sit with that thought for a moment. An entire stage of a woman's life, marked not by a birthday, not by a ceremony inside a church, but by something as small and personal as where she was permitted to wear her own hair. And if you think today's beauty routines demand patience, imagine this. Some of the elaborate updos that grew fashionable through the decades required so many pins, so much hidden padding, and so much careful construction that a lady's maid needed something akin to an engineer's steady hand just to keep the whole structure standing upright through an entire evening of dinner and dancing. More than one exhausted mother after a long ball admitted in her private letters that dismantling her daughter's hairstyle at midnight felt like taking apart a small building, one pin at a time, by candlelight, half asleep on her feet. If Agnes had ever been asked to list her talents on a piece of paper, patience and a very steady set of hands would have sat near the very top. Here is where the story grows more interesting. Once a woman's hair had been put up for good, only a small, trusted circle of people were ever permitted to see it down again. A husband, a mother, perhaps a sister or a devoted lady's maid like Agnes standing quietly behind Charlotte's chair. To let your hair down in front of anyone beyond that circle, a neighbour, a gentleman caller, even a fond acquaintance of the family, could be understood as something almost improper, not because the hair itself was shameful in any way, but because it belonged entirely to the smallest and safest part of a woman's private life. There was one single exception to this rule, and it is a particularly lovely one. On her wedding day, a young bride was often permitted to wear her hair loose beneath her veil, one final time flowing freely for the whole world to witness. Guests would notice it quietly without ever needing to remark on it out loud. It was meant as a gentle symbol, one last morning as a girl belonging to no one in particular, before she stepped forward to belong fully and publicly to a husband and a household of her own. By the following morning that same hair would already be pinned up again, and it would stay that way for the rest of her married life. This single custom explains why in almost every portrait, every early photograph of a respectable Victorian woman you've ever come across, her hair sits neatly in place, controlled, contained. A grown woman photographed with her hair hanging loose in public was not simply making an unusual fashion choice. She was, whether she intended it or not, saying something about herself that polite society was rarely prepared to hear. Now here is something most people tend to get wrong about this entire picture. It is easy enough to imagine Victorian women simply enjoying all this fuss over their hair, vanity dressed up neatly in lace and ribbon, but that view misses something important sitting just beneath the surface, because the flip side of treating a woman's hair as a crowning glory was treating the loss of it as something dangerously similar to a small death. If a woman fell seriously ill with a high fever, physicians of the period sometimes ordered her hair cut short, believing it would cool the head and help speed her recovery. Families dreaded receiving that particular order, not because they doubted the medicine of the day. Everybody in that room understood, without needing to say it aloud, exactly what such a loss would mean to her long after the fever had passed. And in certain asylums and workhouses scattered across England, cutting a woman's hair the moment she arrived was standard practice. A swift, silent way of stripping away her sense of self, her individuality, even a small piece of her dignity, before she had spoken a single word to anyone inside those walls. Some of these institutions kept careful ledgers noting the exact date a woman's hair was cut, almost as though it marked the true beginning of her stay far more than the date written on her admission papers. So when history calls a Victorian woman's hair her crowning glory, it's not only speaking about beauty, it is speaking about power, about identity, about one particular part of a woman's body that an entire society had quietly agreed to treat as something nearly sacred. And like anything a society decides to treat as sacred, it could just as easily be taken away as punishment, as it could be praised and admired as virtue. Beauty and control, it turns out, were never as far apart as they first appear. Of course, not every woman in England had someone like Agnes standing patiently behind her chair each morning. For a farmer's wife or a young woman working long hours inside a cotton mill, this same crowning glory still had to be managed and cared for only in a fraction of the time, with far fewer hands to help and far less lace and ribbon to hide behind. Her hair still carried the very same expectations, the very same quiet judgment from her neighbours, only with none of the servants, the mirrors or the spare hour each morning that a household like Charlotte's could offer. That particular story looks nothing like Charlotte's, and it deserves its own honest telling before this journey reaches its end. Back in the dressing room, Agnes finished her work. The final pin slid quietly into place, and Charlotte's hair, once loose and simple as a young girl's, had now been coiled into the smooth, structured shape that would carry her steadily through morning calls, an afternoon of correspondence, and a formal dinner later that evening. A shape that had likely taken the better part of an hour to build, strand by careful strand parted neatly down the middle and gathered low at the back of her neck, the way most respectable women of her circle wore it that particular year. Charlotte studied her reflection in the glass for a long moment. Then she rose, smoothed the front of her skirts, and walked toward the sound of breakfast being laid downstairs, her crowning glory carefully arranged and hidden in plain sight for whatever the day still had in store. Nobody at that breakfast table would ever comment on her hair directly, and yet without a single word being spoken, every person seated there would already know exactly what her hair was telling them about who she was. But every single evening, once the last guest had gone home and the house had settled into quiet, all of that careful construction would come undone again, pin by pin, alone by candlelight with nobody watching but herself, or perhaps Agnes standing just behind her brush, already resting in hand. That quiet private hour, the one almost nobody outside a woman's own household ever witnessed, is exactly where we are headed next. By the time the last carriage rolled away down the drive and the house finally settled into its evening quiet, Charlotte was back in front of that same small mirror, only now the candle beside it burned lower, and the light it threw across the room felt warmer, softer, almost forgiving. Agnes stood behind her again, only this time there was no rush in her hands, no dinner to reach on time, no morning calls waiting downstairs, just Charlotte, the candle, and the slow work of undoing everything that had been so carefully built that morning. Pin by pin the shape came apart, and once the last one had been set down on the little dish beside the mirror, Charlotte's hair fell loose again down past her waist, the same way it had looked at the very start of the day, except tired now and slightly flattened from hours spent pinned in place. This was the part of a woman's day that almost nobody outside her own household ever witnessed. Not a ball, not a dinner party. Just a quiet hour behind a shut door where the real work of caring for that crowning glory actually happened. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever done something 100 times every single night, simply because somebody once told you it mattered? Because that is exactly what was expected of a respectable woman's hair in this period. Household guides and beauty columns of the era were remarkably specific about it, and remarkably consistent decade after decade, almost as though every single one had copied the last. Take the hair down each evening, comb it through evenly, and then brush it from the scalp all the way to the very end's 100 stroke without fail. Nobody quite agreed on where the number first came from. There was no doctor's study behind it, no careful measurement proving 100 strokes healthier than 80, or safer than 200. And yet it travelled from one ladies' magazine to the next, printed in almost identical language, until it settled into English homes as a kind of quiet law nobody thought to question anymore. Writers of the era liked to describe routines like this one using the language of health and science, calling them hygienic laws, as though a hairbrush belonged in the same serious category as fresh air or clean water. It was no accident. England in this period had grown rather fond of the whole idea of hygiene, convinced that discipline applied faithfully to the smallest daily habits reflected a stronger, steadier character underneath. A woman who brushed her hair without fail night after night was quietly understood to be a woman who could be trusted with everything else in her household too. It is a strange thing if you stop to consider it how easily a single round number can take hold of an entire culture simply by being repeated with enough confidence and dressed up in the sturdy language of science. We do something rather similar today, chasing 10,000 steps on a watch that very few of us could actually explain either. The technique itself mattered just as much as the count. A proper brushing did not simply skim the surface of the hair. The bristles were meant to begin right at the scalp, pressed in firmly enough to be felt against the skin, then drawn slowly downward through the full length of the hair section by section. Some writers described it almost like tending a garden, loosening the hair underneath rather than flattening it against the head, allowing air to move freely through every part of it. Speed was never the point. The point was patience, thoroughness, and a kind of steady repeated attention that modern life rarely leaves much room for anymore. Naturally, not everybody agreed on how vigorous this brushing ought to be. One camp of writers insisted on a firm hand, believing a gentle touch achieved nothing beyond smoothing the surface. Another camp warned that overly rough brushing pulled hair from the root before its time, leaving a woman thinner and sadder by middle age than she needed to be. Sisters within the very same household could hold opposing opinions on the matter, one brushing with real force each night, the other barely grazing the scalp, each entirely convinced her own method was the wiser one. Charlotte's own younger cousin, visiting for a fortnight the previous spring, had teased her more than once for brushing so gently that it barely counted as brushing at all, insisting her own maid use something closer to real effort. Charlotte had simply laughed and pointed out that her cousin's hair, no matter how vigorously treated, seemed to break rather more often at the ends than her own. There was rarely any final answer to disagreements like this one. Only habit, family opinion, and whichever piece of advice happened to travel through a household first. Now here is where the picture grows a little more honest and rather more human. Plenty of etiquette writers scolded their readers for failing to keep up this nightly habit at all. More than a few complained quite pointedly that too many women climbed straight into bed with their hair still pinned exactly as it had been worn all day, far too weary after a long evening out to bother taking it down properly, let alone brushing it 100 times by candlelight. So if you have ever fallen asleep without doing the one small evening ritual you promised yourself you would keep, take some comfort in this. Even women living inside a supposedly perfect orderly world were quietly cutting the very same corners we still cut today. For Agnes, though, cutting corners was rarely much of an option. This was her work night after night for as many years as she remained in service first to one household, and likely to several more after this one. 100 strokes does not sound like much until your own arm has performed it. For the third woman that week wrist aching shoulder tight, while the lady seated in front of the mirror simply closes her eyes and enjoys the quiet, seldom pausing to wonder how the count felt from the other side of the brush. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Behind almost every gentle, restful image we still hold of Victorian beauty, there was very often another woman standing just out of frame doing the actual labour required to produce it one stroke at a time, night after night, for wages that barely covered her own keep. Not every woman had an Agnes waiting behind her chair, of course. A woman travelling without her maid or a widow keeping a smaller household on her own still faced the very same 100 strokes each evening, only now with her own tired arm doing all the work twisted awkwardly behind her own head, counting under her breath in a mirror propped against a washstand in some unfamiliar room. It was by every account considerably harder to do properly alone, and more than one letter from the period admits almost sheepishly to giving up somewhere around stroke 60, promising to make up the difference the following night instead. There was more to the evening than simple counting too. Many households followed a particular rule for how hair should rest through the long hours of sleep itself. Rather than leaving it loose and tangled across a pillow, a woman's hair was often gathered into a single loose plait before bed, low and soft, nothing like the tight structured braid worn by a child during daylight hours. This overnight plait served a truly practical purpose, protecting the hair from knots and unnecessary friction against rough linen sheets, while still allowing the scalp to breathe properly until morning. In wealthier homes, a woman might also wrap her plait loosely in a strip of silk before settling under the covers, since silk, unlike coarse cotton, was believed to smooth the hair rather than roughen it through a night of restless turning. And then there was the brush itself, which came with its own quiet set of expectations. A good household brush made from natural bristle rather than anything stiff or artificial was meant to be cleaned often, sometimes daily, worked through warm water mixed with a little bicarbonate of soda, then left to dry completely before it ever touched a woman's hair again. Some writers were almost fierce on this particular point, insisting that a dirty, neglected brush undid every bit of good that careful brushing was meant to achieve. It was one thing after all to count out 100 strokes each night with real devotion. It was quite another to be doing it unknowingly with a brush that had not been properly cleaned in weeks, simply passing the same dust and old oil back through freshly washed hair. Brushing was rarely the very last step of the evening either. Many women finished by working a small amount of scented oil through the ends of their hair, a habit so common across 19th-century England that it left behind an entirely unexpected piece of furniture. One particular oil sold under the name Macassar grew so fashionable among men and women alike that it began staining the backs of upholstered chairs in parlours across the country wherever a head came to rest against the fabric for too long. Housewives grew so weary of ruined chair backs that a small decorative cloth was invented specifically to guard against the damage, a cloth still known today by the very name of the oil that made it necessary in the first place. The next time you notice a lace cover draped neatly over the back of an old armchair, you're looking at a small piece of furniture history that began quite plainly with a woman's nightly hair ritual and a stain nobody could quite scrub out of the good chairs. Here is a small detail I find rather charming in an odd sort of way. Whatever hair came loose during all that brushing, caught gently between the bristles, was very rarely thrown away without a second thought. Older folk beliefs in parts of England held that stray hair left carelessly about the house could bring genuine trouble to its owner. Some households quietly believed that if a bird carried off a woman's fallen hair to build its nest, she would suffer from headaches for as long as that nest remained standing nearby. Others told the very opposite version of the same story, insisting that a bird weaving a young woman's hair into its nest was a quiet sign she would be married within the year, which meant a single strand caught on a garden hedge could be taken as either a warning or a small piece of good fortune, depending entirely on which grandmother happened to be telling the story that week. Whatever the belief in a particular household, almost nobody felt entirely easy leaving loose strands of themselves scattered where a stranger might come across them. So the hair collected during brushing was often tucked carefully away instead, saved inside a small dish or a covered jar beside the mirror waiting for a purpose. We will return to a little later in this story. For Charlotte, none of this ever felt like superstition exactly. It felt more like habit passed down without much explanation, the way certain small rituals simply survive inside a family long after anyone remembers precisely why they began. Her own mother had kept a little china dish for the very same purpose, tucked in the very same corner of a very similar mirror, years before Charlotte ever sat down to do the same thing herself. Tell me honestly, is there some small ritual you still keep every night before sleep when you would struggle to explain to anyone who asked why it mattered so much to you? A certain order to washing your face, perhaps, or a particular side of the bed you have to fall asleep on? If so, you already understand exactly what kept women like Charlotte returning to that mirror evening after evening, long after the reason behind it had faded quietly into simple habit. By the time Agnes finished her 100 strokes that particular evening, Charlotte's hair had taken on a softer shine in the candlelight, loose and warm, and completely her own, seen by absolutely nobody beyond these four walls. She reached up once, almost without thinking, and ran her fingers slowly along one section near her temple, testing it the way you might check whether a fire has truly gone out before leaving a room for the night. It would have been easy to assume, watching all of this, that 100 careful strokes each evening was the whole of it. That once the brushing was finished, a woman's hair required nothing more until the very same routine began again the following morning. And notice, if you will, everything we have described tonight so far. The brushing, the oiling, the careful overnight plait. Not one single drop of water has touched Charlotte's hair this entire evening, nor will it for quite some time yet. That absence was not an oversight on my part. It was in truth exactly how most Victorian women approach their own hair, and it sat at the centre of one of the strangest, most fiercely debated questions of the entire century. How exactly was a woman supposed to keep hair this long, this thick and this precious clean, when the very act of washing it properly was widely believed to threaten the whole crowning glory everybody had worked so hard every single night to protect? Wash day, as it turned out, did not arrive nearly as often as you might expect. In fact, if you had asked 3 different women in Charlotte's own village how frequently a lady ought to wash her hair, you would very likely have received 3 entirely different answers, each one delivered with complete and total confidence. Some households swore by once a week, others insisted twice a month was more than sufficient for keeping the scalp healthy. And a fair number of respected voices in print women, whose advice appeared in magazine after magazine, argued that once a month was plenty, and that anything more frequent bordered on reckless. One particularly firm writer of the era went so far as to admit quite plainly that she washed her own hair as seldom as she possibly could and saw no reason for anyone to behave differently. Looking back through these old columns today, you would think the writers were discussing entirely different substances rather than the very same head of hair. How often do you suppose your own great-great-grandmother washed her hair? If you had to guess right now, most people assume the answer sits somewhere near daily, simply because that happens to be our own habit today, and it feels strange to imagine anything else being normal. But daily washing for a Victorian woman with hair past her waist was not only impractical, it was considered by nearly every authority of the era actively unwise. Not every woman followed the exact same schedule either, since the advice itself often bent to suit the particular hair sitting underneath it. A woman with finer, thinner hair was frequently told to wash a little more often, since oil travelled down that kind of hair faster and showed itself sooner near the crown. Thicker, coarser hair, the sort Charlotte happened to have inherited from her father's side of the family, could comfortably stretch toward the longer end of that once-a-month guidance without much complaint at all. It was never quite the single universal rule modern imagination tends to picture. It was closer to a loose set of guidelines, quietly adjusted household by household, head by head. Underneath all this disagreement sat a single, rather curious belief shared by nearly everyone, regardless of which camp they belonged to. Water itself was never really the enemy. What frightened people was water left sitting inside the hair, afterward undried quietly, working away at the scalp for hours on end. Left damp for too long, hair was thought to develop a faint, unpleasant smell, the natural oils inside it supposedly breaking down. The longer moisture lingered against the skin. So the real question a Victorian woman faced was never simply whether to wash her hair. It was whether she had enough hours left in her day to dry it thoroughly afterward without setting foot outdoors while it was still damp. Because stepping outside with wet hair carried its own particular danger in the Victorian imagination, and this one had nothing to do with smell at all. Damp hair exposed to a cold English breeze was widely believed to invite illness directly into the body chills, fevers, even the beginnings of something far more serious. A mother catching her daughter heading out the door with hair still wet from washing would very likely call her straight back inside, truly alarmed the same way a parent today might panic over a child running outside in winter without a coat. Whether or not the science behind that fear held up the fear itself was entirely real, and it shaped an enormous amount of behaviour around something as ordinary as washing one's hair. So when wash day did arrive in Charlotte's household, it was treated less like a quick morning task and more like a small planned event. Agnes would begin early, well before breakfast, heating jug after jug of water over the kitchen fire and carrying them upstairs one careful trip at a time, since running water. Reaching directly into a bedroom basin was still, for most homes outside the larger cities, more of a modern fantasy than a daily reality. Each trip up the narrow back staircase meant balancing a heavy jug against one hip, careful not to spill scalding water on the worn wooden steps, a task Agnes performed without complaint, though her arms undoubtedly told a different story by the fourth or fifth trip. Charlotte would kneel forward over a large basin set near the fireplace, her hair draped down in front of her, while Agnes worked warm water through it, section by careful section, the fire crackling nearby and the whole small room growing warm and slightly steamy in a way that felt, oddly enough, rather cosy despite all the fuss involved. There was no bottle of shampoo waiting on a shelf, of course. Instead, the washing mixture itself was something closer to a kitchen recipe than a cosmetic product. One common method called for boiling water together with a handful of wheat, bran and a little pure white soap strained through cloth, then worked gently into the scalp, the whole kitchen filling with a warm, faintly toasted smell that had nothing at all in common with the sharp floral scent of a modern shampoo aisle. Another approach, considered gentler, still involved beating a single egg yolk and massaging it directly into the hair before rinsing everything away with warm water. A third recipe, favoured in households that preferred something a little more refined, combined a small amount of borax with olive oil and water, worked through the hair in slow, patient circles before rinsing clean. Women who tried the egg yolk method often described their hair afterward as remarkably soft, almost silky, and it is worth pointing out that modern hairdressers occasionally recommend something remarkably similar today, minus the bran of course, and usually with a rather nicer bottle involved. Now here is a small question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment. Have you ever assumed an old habit was simply backward only to discover once you actually looked closer that it made a strange kind of sense within its own world? Because that is rather how I feel about egg yolk shampoo. It sounds on the surface like something out of a peculiar bedtime story rather than an actual grooming routine, and yet egg yolk truly does contain natural fats and proteins, not entirely unlike ingredients quietly listed on shampoo bottles lining pharmacy shelves today. Victorian women were not being foolish. They were simply working with what their own kitchens could provide. Drying afterward presented its own entirely separate challenge, and this is where things grow a little stranger to modern ears. Without any device to speed the process along, a woman with hair reaching well past her waist faced hours of sitting near a fire, turning her head slowly from side to side, waiting for the dampness to lift on its own. To help matters along, many households relied on a technique that sounds almost bizarre today. Fine powdered starch was brushed thoroughly through the hair while it was still damp section by section, the starch quietly soaking up moisture the way a modern towel might before being brushed out again entirely once the hair had dried. A woman who had just washed her hair might spend a good portion of an afternoon looking faintly dusted in white, a little like a baker fresh from her own kitchen, patiently waiting for both the starch and the last traces of dampness to disappear before she considered herself properly presentable again. Agnes more than once teased Charlotte gently about resembling a powdered wig from her grandmother's generation on wash days, an old joke between the two of them that never quite lost its charm no matter how many times it was repeated. This particular vulnerability, hair half dry and dusted white with starch, was precisely why wash day required careful timing, and why a household kept a watchful eye on the calendar before choosing a date. An unexpected caller arriving mid-morning on the wrong day could catch a lady entirely unprepared, her hair still down, still damp, still very much a private matter, rather than something fit for a parlour visit. Charlotte's own mother liked to tell the story of a distant cousin who once had to greet an unannounced clergyman from an upstairs window, hair wrapped hastily in a length of cloth, calling down excuses about a sudden headache rather than admit the truth of what her hair actually looked like at that particular hour. Whether every detail of that old family story was entirely accurate hardly mattered. It captured something true about just how seriously a woman's unfinished hair was treated even inside her own home, even among people who almost certainly would have forgiven her instantly for it. Interestingly enough, the season of the year actually shifted how often all of this took place, and not necessarily in the direction you might guess. Winter rather than summer tended to bring more frequent washing in many households, largely because heavier clothing would smoke drifting through every room, and long hours spent near open fires left hair feeling grimier, faster than the lighter days of summer ever did. Summer, by contrast, often meant washing less, precisely because drying hair thoroughly beside a blazing fire in the middle of a warm afternoon felt like an entirely unnecessary discomfort nobody particularly wanted to sit through. If you had grown up assuming people simply washed less full stop in every century before running water, and proper drainage arrived, this small seasonal detail rather complicates that tidy little story, does it not? Victorian households were reacting to their actual circumstances, weighing genuine discomfort against genuine risk, season by season rather than following one single fixed rule all year round. Between full washings, women were far from neglectful about their hair, even if actual water rarely touched it. A simple rinse made from fresh rosemary steeped in boiling water was a favourite in many households, splashed lightly over the hair and scalp to freshen it without the trouble of a full wash. Charlotte kept a small bundle of dried rosemary tied with string in a corner of her dressing room for exactly this purpose, a scent she associated so strongly with those quieter mornings that decades later the smell alone could apparently still call the whole memory back in an instant. Once her hair was finally dry, one more small step remained before Charlotte could consider herself properly finished, particularly if company was expected that afternoon. A thin, clear liquid known as bandoline was smoothed carefully over the surface of the hair, meant to hold loose strands neatly in place without any heavier oil weighing them down. Making it was a small kitchen project in itself. A spoonful of quince seed saved from the previous autumn's fruit was simmered gently in water until the liquid thickened into something faintly sticky and clear, strained carefully to remove every last seed before it was poured into a small glass bottle for use. Made most often this way, bandoline worked in a manner not entirely unlike the setting gels sitting in bathroom cabinets today, though considerably more delicate and admittedly far less convenient to prepare on a Tuesday morning before breakfast. Taken together, brushing each night, washing perhaps once every few weeks, powdered starch, rosemary rinses and a dab of quince seed bandoline, an enormous amount of quiet, patient labour went into hair that most people outside Charlotte's own household would only ever glimpse pinned neatly beneath a bonnet. Nobody at church on a Sunday morning could have told you whether her hair had been washed the previous Tuesday or 3 full weeks earlier, and in a strange way that was rather the entire point. The effort was real. The result was meant to look effortless. It raises a rather interesting question about our own habits, does it not? We tend to imagine people from this period as somehow less concerned with cleanliness than we are today, when the truth sits closer to the opposite. Victorian women were deeply attentive to their hair, thoughtful, even working carefully within the limits of what their own century had to offer them. They simply organised that attention around an entirely different set of fears and assumptions than the ones guiding a bathroom shelf full of products today. And here is something worth remembering, particularly if you find yourself picturing weeks of unwashed hair as something unpleasant. Remember that nightly ritual of 100 careful brush strokes, the one Charlotte never skipped, no matter how tired she felt. That habit was not simply decorative. Brushing that thoroughly night after night actually helped carry natural oil away from the scalp and gently down along the length of the hair, distributing it evenly rather than leaving it pooled at the roots. In a strange roundabout way, one careful ritual quietly supported the other. The nightly brushing bought a woman a few extra clean, comfortable weeks between washings, whether she ever understood the exact reason behind it or not. Charlotte's hair, dry rinsed with rosemary and lightly smoothed with bandoline, was finally ready to be shaped into whatever style the day required of her. But clean, dry hair was really only the beginning of the story, not the end of it. A head of hair that simply hung straight and loose, clean as it was never considered properly finished for a woman of Charlotte's standing. And turning it into the elegant curls, coils and waves, fashionable at particular season, demanded tools of an entirely different and considerably more dangerous sort altogether. Several of them, as it happens, came dangerously near an open flame in a manner that would make almost any modern hairdresser wince the moment they saw it happening. There was a particular smell that lingered in certain houses on the evening before a ball one that had absolutely nothing to do with dinner cooking downstairs. It was faint, sharp, and slightly acrid, the unmistakable scent of hair meeting heat for just a fraction of a second too long. If you had grown up in a house full of sisters, you would know that smell instantly, and you would also know exactly what it meant. Somebody somewhere upstairs was curling her hair. Downstairs, a house preparing for an evening out carried its own familiar rhythm, footmen polishing silver, a cook fussing over some final dish, the low murmur of a household settling into motion. But upstairs, behind a closed dressing room's door, the atmosphere was something else entirely. Candles burned a little brighter than usual. A faint haze occasionally drifted near the mirror. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat a woman, perfectly still, trusting a length of hot metal only inches from her own scalp to a hand steadier than her own. For an ordinary evening, curls were rarely worth the trouble. Straight, smooth hair, carefully brushed and pinned, suited most days perfectly well. But for a ball, a wedding, or an important dinner, curls became something closer to a requirement, and achieving them safely was an entirely different matter altogether, one that occupied a great deal more thought than most people today would ever guess. Think for a moment about your own morning routine before something important, a job interview perhaps, or a first date. Now imagine that same nervous preparation stretched out across an entire evening with fire involved. That is roughly the emotional temperature of a Victorian dressing room the night before a proper ball. The gentlest method, and by far the most common one, required no heat whatsoever. Long strips of soft cloth, often cut from a worn-out petticoat, or an old length of ribbon no longer fit for anything else, were used to wrap small sections of hair around one strip after another, until an entire head was covered in what looked frankly a little ridiculous by candlelight. Some households favoured strips of ordinary newspaper instead of cloth, a cheaper option available to nearly anyone, though one that carried its own small hazard. Damp printer's ink had an unfortunate habit of transferring onto pale hair if the paper was not dry enough beforehand, leaving faint smudged lines that no amount of brushing could fully lift before morning. Charlotte's own aunt told a story often repeated at family gatherings of an unfortunate cousin who appeared at breakfast one morning with a distinctly grey streak above one ear, courtesy of the previous evening's newspaper. Charlotte had done this herself the night before, more balls than she could count, sitting patiently while Agnes wrapped each section carefully around its own strip of cloth, tied it snug against the scalp, and moved steadily on to the next. Sleeping in a head full of rags was by every honest account deeply uncomfortable, and more than one woman admitted in her private letters to spending half the night shifting and turning, trying to find a single position that did not press some knot of cloth directly against her skull. Here is a small question for you. Have you ever suffered through an uncomfortable night's sleep purely in the name of looking a particular way the following morning? If the answer is yes, you already understand exactly what drove women to endure this particular discomfort year after year, decade after decade, without much complaint at all. Beauty, it turns out, has asked for sacrifices of one kind or another in almost every century, only the specific sacrifice tends to change. By morning, once every strip of cloth had been carefully unwound, the reward was a full head of soft, natural-looking curls achieved without a single flame anywhere near the hair. It is when you stop to consider it remarkably similar to a method still used today, minus the cloth strips themselves replaced now by foam rollers or flexible rods sold in any drugstore. The core idea, wrapping hair around something and letting it set overnight, has apparently never really gone out of fashion, only the materials involved have quietly changed. Rag curling, though, took an entire night to produce results, and a night was not always something a woman had to spare. An invitation might arrive on short notice. An unexpected guest might require a woman to look her best within the hour, and for situations exactly like these, a second method existed considerably faster and considerably more dangerous. The curling iron, or curling tongs as they were more commonly called, consisted of two narrow metal rods joined together, heated directly in the coals of a fire, or held carefully over the open flame of a candle until they reached the right temperature. There was no dial to check, no indicator light, nothing at all to measure heat with any real precision. A woman, or more often her maid, had to judge the temperature entirely by instinct and experience, relying on years of quiet practice to know the difference between hot enough to curl and hot enough to scorch. The handle end was typically wrapped in a scrap of leather or thick cloth to protect the fingers holding it, since the metal travelled heat along its full length, far faster than anyone holding it would prefer. A single section of hair was curled carefully around the heated rod, held in place for only a few careful seconds, and released quickly before it had any real chance to burn. This is where a particular little trick comes in, one I find truly clever once you understand the reasoning behind it. Before the heated tongs ever touched a single strand of actual hair, they were pressed briefly against a scrap of paper or sometimes a spare piece of cloth kept specifically for this purpose. If the paper scorched or turned brown, the tongs were left to cool for a moment before trying again. If it survived untouched, the iron was judged safe enough to use. It was in its own rough and homemade way a genuine safety test invented and passed down entirely through household experience decades before anyone had ever heard the words quality control. Even with that, careful testing accidents still happened, and rather more often than most people today would assume. Burns on the neck, the ear, or the back of the hand were common enough that few households considered them worth remarking on beyond a wince and a dab of butter or ointment. The distinctive smell of singed hair drifting through an upstairs hallway was such a familiar part of getting ready for an evening out that it barely registered as unusual, simply one more small cost, folded quietly into the price of looking properly fashionable. The danger extended a little further than singed hair and sore fingertips too. An entire household of candles, open fireplaces and long-hanging fabric curtains, bed linens, the wide skirts fashionable through much of the century, meant that anyone working near an open flame while distracted by a curling iron was taking on a genuine risk. One newspapers of the period occasionally reported on when things went badly wrong. Sensible households kept a jug of water and a heavy blanket within easy reach of any dressing room where curling irons were regularly used. A quiet, practical precaution that most women simply accepted as part of getting ready. The same way a modern household might keep a fire extinguisher tucked beneath the kitchen sink without ever really expecting to need it. Charlotte still remembered rather vividly a particular evening when her own cousin, the same one so proud of her vigorous brushing technique, had grown impatient waiting for her tongs to reach the correct heat and pressed them against her hair a moment too soon. The result was not a serious burn, but a small, unmistakably scorched section near her temple that no amount of clever arranging could fully hide for the rest of that evening. Her cousin laughed about it eventually, though, not until several days had passed and the story became something of a standing joke between them, for years afterward, brought up any time either woman reached for a curling iron with more haste than patience. Now here is something worth pausing on for a moment, because it says a great deal about how far people were willing to go for a single evening's appearance. A woman who would never have dreamed of holding an open flame near her hair on an ordinary afternoon thought nothing of doing precisely that deliberately and carefully the night before a ball. Risk, it seems, has always been judged rather differently depending on what sits on the other side of it. We still make exactly this kind of quiet bargain today, reaching for a flat iron heated well, past the point of comfort or curling wands that regularly leave small red marks on an ear or a wrist, all in service of a single important evening. Tell me honestly, has a hot styling tool ever left its mark on you, even briefly, in pursuit of a look you decided was worth it? If so, you are standing in a rather long and surprisingly unbroken line of women reaching back well over a century. There was, for a brief and rather curious stretch of years, an entirely different solution altogether, one that leaned not on cloth or flame, but on machinery. During the 1860s, a fashion swept through certain circles in Britain for mechanical hair-brushing devices, elaborate contraptions built to brush a woman's hair for her powered by a hand crank or a small foot pedal rather than a maid's tired arm. Some versions sat on their own small stand beside the dressing table, brushes rotating steadily, while a woman simply held her head beneath them, an experience early advertisements compared rather grandly to visiting a proper salon without ever needing to leave one's own bedroom. Advertisements of the period promised efficiency, luxury, and a faintly futuristic thrill, the same excitement modern advertisements still reach for whenever a new gadget promises to make an old chore feel suddenly effortless. Whether these machines actually brushed hair any better than a patient human hand remains rather doubtful, and more than a few households treated them mainly as a curiosity to show visiting friends, rather than a genuine replacement for Agnes and her steady 100 strokes each night. A machine, after all, could not judge how a particular section of hair felt beneath the bristles, could not sense when a knot needed gentler treatment, and certainly could not offer the quiet, familiar company of another person sitting nearby in candlelight. What these devices undeniably offered was novelty, and for a certain kind of household eager to appear fashionable, and forward-thinking novelty alone was often worth the considerable expense involved, no matter how briefly the fashion for them actually lasted. None of these tools, rags, tongs, or the occasional curious machine ever fully replaced one another. Instead, each simply found its own particular place within a woman's week. Rags for an ordinary ball with plenty of warning, tongs for a rushed morning or an unexpected invitation, and for those wealthy enough to indulge a passing fashion, a mechanical brush trotted out mainly to impress visiting friends rather than to truly improve on decades of careful, patient hand brushing. A poorer household, of course, made do with whichever single method it could manage, usually the rag, since old cloth cost nothing beyond a little patience, while a proper set of curling tongs represented a real purchase one not every family found easy to justify. Underneath every method, though, sat the very same quiet understanding shared across the entire century. A woman's hair was worth real risk, real discomfort, and real effort night after night, no matter which particular tool happened to deliver that effort. It is worth noticing, too, how much quiet skill sat behind something so many people today would dismiss as pure vanity. Judging heat by instinct alone, testing an iron against paper before it ever touched living hair, knowing precisely how many seconds a curl needed before it set without scorching, none of this arrived naturally. It was learned carefully, often through a small burn or two along the way, passed from an older sister to a younger one, from a mother to a daughter, from one lady's maid to the next girl taken on in service. We rarely think of hairstyling as a genuine craft requiring real expertise, yet watching Agnes work a heated iron through Charlotte's hair without a single mishap, night after night, year after year, it becomes rather difficult to call it anything else. By the time Charlotte's curls had finally cooled and set into place ready for whatever evening lay ahead of her, one thing had become perfectly clear across everything we have explored so far. The daily upkeep of hair, the brushing, the washing, the curling, all of it only accounts for half of the entire picture. because a curl, no matter how carefully achieved, still had to be gathered, pinned, and shaped into an actual style, and the particular style considered fashionable changed sometimes dramatically with almost every passing decade of the century, transforming a woman's whole silhouette in ways that had very little to do with the curls themselves and everything to do with the age she happened to be living through. Somewhere along the upstairs corridor of Charlotte's house hung a small, unremarkable row of portraits, the kind most visitors walked straight past without a second glance. Charlotte, though, found herself pausing there more often than she probably should have, particularly on quiet afternoons when the rest of the house had gone still, candlelight from a nearby sconce catching the old varnish and throwing soft, warm reflections across each painted face in turn. Because if you looked closely enough, that ordinary little corridor was quietly doing something rather extraordinary. It was tracking portrait by portrait exactly how a woman's hair had transformed across an entire century, one generation folding neatly into the next, long before anyone in that house had the slightest idea they were living inside a chapter of something so much larger than themselves. Have you ever flipped through an old family photo album and found yourself laughing not unkindly at hairstyle? Someone once considered the absolute height of fashion, a parent's wedding photograph perhaps, or a grandmother's portrait from her own youth, the kind of style that felt utterly essential in its own decade and faintly ridiculous in every decade that followed. That particular experience is far from a modern invention. Charlotte felt exactly the same amused tenderness standing in front of these very same portraits generations before photo albums as we know them ever existed, tracing one gilded frame after another with a single curious finger. The first portrait right at the far end of the corridor showed Charlotte's own grandmother as a young bride, painted not long after a young queen had first taken the throne. Her hair was parted with almost mathematical precision straight down the centre, smoothed flat against her skull with barely a strand out of place, then gathered into a simple, modest coil at the back of her neck. There was nothing showy about it whatsoever, and that restraint was very much the entire point. The young queen herself had set the tone for the whole nation with a strikingly plain, unfussy style of her own, and countless women across England quietly followed her example, whether out of true admiration or simple social instinct. Dignity, not spectacle, was the fashionable virtue of that particular decade, and a woman's hair was expected to reflect exactly that. Children in this same early period wore their hair rather differently from their mothers, long loose ringlets tumbling freely around the face, a look grown women would never have dared adopt for themselves once they had properly come of age. It is worth pausing on that small detail for a moment, since it runs almost exactly opposite to what modern instinct might assume. We tend to picture the past growing steadily more relaxed as it approaches our own time, yet here quite plainly a style considered perfectly appropriate for a child was judged entirely unsuitable for the grown woman that same child would eventually become. Growing up in a very real sense meant trading soft tumbling curls for a far stricter, more disciplined arrangement, a small daily reminder of exactly which stage of life a woman now belonged to, long before Charlotte's own aunt ever sat her down and spoke those 5 familiar words about putting her hair up for good. Move a few steps further down the corridor and the style shifts noticeably. This was Charlotte's own mother, painted sometime in her middle years, hair no longer smoothed quite so flat against the head. By this point, fuller skirts held out wide by stiff-structured petticoats had become the fashion of the day, great domed shapes that could sweep an entire side table off its feet if a woman turned too carelessly in a crowded parlour. Hair, almost as though responding to the very same instinct for balance, grew fuller, too padded gently at the sides into soft rounded shapes some called wings, framing the face rather than simply flattening against it. It is a small but rather telling detail about how fashion actually works. A dress rarely changes shape in complete isolation. The whole silhouette shifts together from the hem all the way up to the crown of the head, each part quietly adjusting itself to keep the entire picture in proportion. A narrow plain coil sitting above an enormous, sweeping skirt would have looked almost comically small, like a single candle balanced on top of a wedding cake built for 50 guests. By the time we reach a portrait or two further along the chignon, that neat coiled bun sitting at the back of the head had begun drifting steadily backward and upward, no longer resting gently at the nape of the neck the way it had for Charlotte's grandmother, but climbing higher, growing rounder, echoing the increasingly dramatic curve of a woman's silhouette from the side. Skirts by this point had reached what many considered their absolute limit, so wide that doorways occasionally required a small practiced sideways turn to pass through gracefully. Fashion writers of the time spoke of an elegant curved line running from the crown of the head all the way down through the back of a gown, and hair played its own quiet part in completing that particular shape. A portrait from this period shows a young cousin of Charlotte's grandmother hair, coiled into a wide loose net at the back of her head, decorated with a simple ribbon, an arrangement that photographs of the period suggest took a truly considerable amount of daily patience to keep looking effortless. Which brings us rather naturally to Charlotte's own hair, the very style Agnes has been carefully building and rebuilding throughout this story so far. Fashion by this point in the century had grown taller, still favouring elaborate braided arrangements piled high and structured near the crown of the head, occasionally described rather charmingly as a kind of hair crown, two thick braids circling the head like a coronet. Charlotte remembered the very first time Agnes attempted this particular style on her, both of them consulting a small hand-drawn diagram torn from a magazine, laughing quietly together as an early attempt collapsed sideways halfway through breakfast, sending a single hairpin skittering across the floor for the cat to chase. It had taken the better part of a fortnight before Agnes could recreate the shape confidently, without a single pin working itself loose by midday. Achieving a look this substantial required rather more hair than most women naturally possessed, a small complication we will return to before this particular story reaches its end, since the solution to that particular problem is a story all its own. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why do you suppose fashion kept insisting on more height, more volume, more elaborate construction, decade after decade, as though simplicity itself had quietly gone out of style? Part of the answer sits in something almost embarrassingly human. A taller, fuller hairstyle was, among other things, a rather effective way of advertising exactly how much time, money, and household help a woman had access to. Nobody needed to say this out loud at a dinner party. Everybody in the room could simply look and understand perfectly well. It is worth noticing, too, that not every woman in England had the luxury of chasing each new shift in fashion the moment it appeared in a magazine. A farmer's wife or a shopkeeper's daughter might adopt some small echo of the current style, perhaps a slightly fuller coil or a modest fringe trimmed at home with kitchen scissors, while the full elaborate version pictured in the latest illustrations remained firmly out of reach, requiring more spare hours, more spare hair, and considerably more spare money than most households could ever justify spending on something nobody strictly needed. Fashion moved fastest and most extravagantly precisely where the resources existed to keep pace with it. Now, if we step a little further down this same imaginary corridor past the years Charlotte herself actually lived through, fashion took a rather sharp and surprising turn. The elaborate towering styles that had dominated for years fell away or almost entirely replaced by something considerably more severe. Hair was pulled back tightly once again, much nearer the head, though this time a bold new detail appeared at the front that would have startled Charlotte's own grandmother entirely. A fringe tightly curled or frizzed across the forehead suddenly became fashionable, a look some older, more traditional voices in society considered faintly improper, almost too playful for a respectable woman to wear in public. Letters and diaries from households living through that particular decade occasionally preserve exactly this kind of generational disagreement. An older aunt writing with real disapproval about a niece's newly frizzed forehead, convinced the whole look bordered on theatrical rather than respectable, more suited to an actress than a proper young lady calling at the vicarage. The niece naturally thought her aunt hopelessly old-fashioned in return, and likely rolled her eyes the moment the older woman's back was turned exactly as nieces have always done in every single century on record. It is worth remembering that whenever a new style is dismissed by an older generation as somehow too bold or too modern fashion, has quietly been repeating that exact same argument for well over a century. Ask any mother today what she privately thinks of a daughter's latest hair trend, and you will very likely hear some faint echo of that same old family disagreement, dressed up in entirely different words. And then as the century finally approached its end, hair softened again in a way that felt like an entirely different conversation altogether. The tight structured severity gave way to something looser, fuller near the crown rather than the back, swept gently upward into a soft rounded shape secured with a small bun near the very top of the head. This particular look would later be closely associated with a certain confident, independent young woman, appearing in popular illustrations of the period, a figure who rode bicycles, pursued her own education, and moved through public life with a self-assurance earlier decades had rarely extended to women at all. Newspapers and magazines gave this new figure her own name, treating her almost as a recognizable character rather than a passing trend, a woman who worked, studied, and socialized with a freedom her own grandmother could scarcely have imagined at the very same age. Her hairstyle, soft and voluminous rather than tightly restrained, seemed to carry just a little of that same new confidence along with it, as though 6 decades of increasingly elaborate control were finally gently beginning to loosen their grip. It is tempting, and not entirely wrong, to see something a little larger inside that softening. A century that began by asking women to keep every strand pinned into rigid, disciplined order was closing with a style that for the first time in a very long while allowed a little visible looseness near the face, without anyone mistaking it for carelessness. Do you notice anything similar happening in fashion today, hairstyles quietly shifting in step with whatever a particular generation of women happens to be fighting for or finally winning? Think of it for a moment. Every loosened rule, every relaxed silhouette, every style once considered daring enough to raise an eyebrow at church tends to arrive quietly on the heels of some larger shift already moving through women's lives more broadly. History rarely announces these connections outright. It tends to leave them for us to notice much later, standing in a hallway of old portraits, or scrolling slowly through decades of photographs on a small glowing screen, piecing together a story nobody at the time thought they were telling. Standing in that quiet corridor, looking from her grandmother's plain dignified coil all the way to a style she'd only seen sketched in the newest ladies' magazines. Charlotte could not help noticing something rather striking. Every single portrait told you a great deal more than simply how fashionable a woman happened to be. It told you almost without meaning to what her whole world expected of her, whether that meant quiet restraint, careful balance, or a newer, freer kind of confidence still finding its footing. Hair, it turns out, was never simply following fashion. In its own quiet way, it was recording history, one coil, one braid, one carefully placed pin at a time. Of course, none of these increasingly elaborate shapes, the wings, the braided crowns, the towering coils, could be built from a woman's own natural hair alone, no matter how faithfully she had brushed and cared for it every single night. A head of hair, no matter how long and thick, has its own natural limits and fashion. Across every single decade lining that corridor had a rather stubborn habit of demanding more than nature alone was willing to provide. Underneath nearly every one of these fashionable silhouettes sat a rather well-kept secret one, involving pads, padding, and considerably more borrowed hair than most guests at a Victorian dinner party ever suspected, sitting quietly and visibly beneath a stranger's own carefully arranged crown. Do you remember a little while ago that small covered dish sitting quietly beside Charlotte's mirror, the one collecting whatever loose hair came free during her nightly brushing? I promised we would return to it eventually, and here we finally are, because that unassuming little dish turns out to be the real starting point of one of the more surprising secrets sitting underneath nearly every elaborate hairstyle we have discussed so far. By the time Charlotte's dish had been filling steadily for the better part of a year, it held rather more than most people would ever guess. Soft, tangled handfuls of her own hair saved patiently day after day, rather than swept away and forgotten. This particular habit had a proper name in most households. It was called a hair receiver, usually a small porcelain jar with a neat hole cut into the lid, just wide enough to tuck a loose handful of combings through without letting anything blow away or scatter across the dressing table. Some were plain and practical, kept out of sight in a drawer. Others in wealthier households were painted with delicate flowers or gilded around the rim, treated almost as a small piece of decorative furniture in their own right, sitting proudly on display rather than tucked discreetly away, a curious little object that visiting guests occasionally mistook for a trinket box, until someone explained, usually with a small knowing smile, exactly what it actually held inside. Here is a small question worth turning over for a moment. Have you ever kept something ordinary and slightly odd, convinced you would eventually find a use for it long before you actually knew what that use would turn out to be? A drawer full of ribbon offcuts, perhaps, or a jar of mismatched buttons nobody in the house has touched in years. Charlotte's hair receiver worked on exactly that same quiet, patient logic. Only what she was collecting happened to be pieces of herself, gathered one small handful at a time, with no particular deadline attached to any of it, because that dish full of combings was never simply clutter waiting to be thrown out. It was raw material destined to become something called a switch, a length of false hair carefully constructed from a woman's own collected combings and woven back into her existing hairstyle, to add length, thickness, or a little extra shape exactly where it was needed most. Making a switch properly was its own small craft, one Agnes had learned from an older lady's maid years before Charlotte had ever employed her. The loose combings first had to be sorted with real patience, drawn gently through a small tool fitted with fine metal teeth, not unlike a very narrow comb, standing upright on its own little base, which separated tangled, broken strands from the longer, healthier lengths worth keeping. This process, sometimes called drawing the hair, ensured every strand eventually pointed the same direction, root end together, so the finished switch would lie smooth and natural, rather than fuzzy, or reversed against Charlotte's own scalp. The evening Agnes finally emptied Charlotte's full hair receiver onto a clean cloth spread across the dressing table. Both women stared at the resulting little pile with something bordering on surprise. It looked, Charlotte admitted with a small laugh, rather like a sleeping cat curled up beside her hairbrush, and neither of them could quite believe an entire year of quiet, unremarkable brushing had produced something so substantial sitting right there in front of them. Agnes set to work sorting it that same evening, separating the shorter broken pieces destined for nothing more than padding from the longer strands worth saving for the switch itself. Once properly sorted, the good hair was braided or twisted tightly around a small cord, then stitched securely at one end, creating a compact, sturdy piece that could be pinned invisibly into place among Charlotte's real hair. A well-made switch, Agnes liked to say, should never announce itself. Nobody at a dinner party ought to suspect its presence at all, and the truest compliment a switch could ever receive was for absolutely nobody to notice it was there. Think about that process for a moment, because there is something rather moving buried inside all that patient practical work. The elaborate hair crown Agnes had spent an entire fortnight perfecting in our previous story was not built purely from Charlotte's own present-day hair. Woven quietly into that structure sat strands she had shed and saved months earlier, hair grown and lost and gathered again, now returning to sit proudly at the very top of her head. In a strange, rather lovely sort of way, nothing about a woman's crowning glory ever truly went to waste. It simply waited patiently in a small porcelain dish until its moment came back around. There was on occasion an even more personal version of this same practice, one that had nothing to do with fashion whatsoever. A sister recovering from a long illness that had thinned her own hair might quietly receive a switch made from a mother's or a cousin's, careful savings offered not as a gift bought from a catalogue, but as something considerably closer to a small private act of love stitched together, strand by patient strand, specifically for her. There was no advertisement for that particular kind of switch, and no price tag attached to it either. It existed purely within the family, one more small thread in the same quiet, ongoing pattern of women taking care of each other's crowning glory in ways the rest of the household rarely noticed or thought to ask about. Not every fashionable style could be built from combings alone, though no matter how faithfully a woman saved them. The particularly tall, structured looks growing popular through these decades required something with real bulk underneath the visible hair, a foundation strong enough to hold an elaborate shape through an entire evening of dancing without slowly collapsing sideways by midnight. This foundation had its own rather unflattering nickname whispered about more than openly discussed in polite company. Women called them rats. A rat was in essence a small padded cushion, sometimes stuffed with wool, sometimes with additional loose hair, occasionally even shaped from a fine wire mesh, tucked underneath the visible hair to build height and volume exactly where fashion currently demanded it. Placed at the crown, it could turn a modest coil into something considerably grander. Placed toward the back, it gave a chignon the kind of rounded fullness illustrations in the ladies' magazines always seemed to promise. A woman with particularly limited natural hair might use 2 or 3 of these small padded shapes together, layered beneath her real hair like the framework of a garden trellis, waiting for something living to grow over it and hide it from view entirely. Nobody displayed a rat proudly. It sat hidden, entirely invisible once the real hair had been arranged carefully over it, doing its quiet structural work completely out of sight, rather like the wooden frame holding up an elegant piece of upholstered furniture, admired for its finished surface, while nobody ever thinks to mention what sits underneath. Charlotte once overheard 2 older women at a garden party trading remarks in tones of great admiration about a particular young lady's astonishingly full head of hair, entirely unaware, or perhaps simply too polite to mention, that a fair portion of that fullness was quietly resting on a small padded shape, held together with nothing more than wire and good tailoring. Charlotte had to press her lips together rather firmly to keep from smiling into her teacup. Has anyone ever admired something about you entirely sincerely, without the slightest idea of the quiet work sitting behind it? A well-organized cupboard nobody sees you rearrange. a calm, easy manner covering an anxious morning nobody witnessed. Compliments, it turns out, have always tended to land on the finished surface rather than the structure holding it up, and that was every bit as true standing in a garden in the middle of the century as it remains standing in any room today. Now here is where the story grows a little more complicated and a little more honest. Not every woman produced enough combings quickly enough to keep pace with what fashion currently demanded of her. Fine thin hair simply did not shed and regrow fast enough to fill a jar within a reasonable stretch of time, and an important occasion rarely waited politely for a woman's own natural supply to catch up. For situations exactly like these, a woman had another option entirely, one that required no patient months of saving whatsoever. She could simply order what she needed. Mail-order catalogues by the later decades of the century carried entire sections devoted to false hair switches and complete hairpieces, sold by length, weight and shade, delivered directly to a woman's door with the same straightforward convenience as ordering a length of ribbon or a new set of gloves. A woman could hold up a small printed card of hair samples against her own reflection in the mirror, comparing shade against shade under the window light before settling on the closest possible match and sending off her order along with careful payment. Prices varied considerably depending on colour and not always in the direction you might expect. Grey and silver-toned hair, oddly enough, commanded a noticeably higher price than most other shades, since fewer women parted with hair of that particular colour, and demand for it mostly among older women hoping to blend a purchased piece seamlessly with their own greying hair consistently outpaced what natural supply could easily provide. A wig or switch in grey could cost as much as half, again over an ordinary shade, a detail that says a great deal about how thoroughly this entire trade had become an actual functioning market, complete with the same basic laws of supply and demand governing any other goods sold by weight and colour. Rare, unusually pale blonde shades carried a similar premium, prized for exactly the reason any scarce material tends to be prized, simply because there was never quite enough of it to go around. Charlotte herself never needed to order anything through a catalogue, her own dark, thick hair providing more than enough raw material for whatever Agnes needed to construct. But she was well aware the option existed tucked quietly inside the same magazines that dictated which particular style was fashionable that season in the first place, sandwiched between advertisements for scented soap and the latest pattern for a walking dress. It is worth pausing on that a moment. The very same publications instructing women on the ideal shape for their hair were quite often selling them the raw materials needed to actually achieve it, an arrangement modern readers would likely recognize instantly in an entirely different context. Scrolling past an advertisement selling the exact solution to a problem the previous page just spent several paragraphs convincing them they had. There is something worth sitting with honestly here beyond the simple mechanics of switches and rats and mail-order catalogues. An entire hidden economy had quietly grown up around something as ordinary as a woman's shed hair, treating it as a genuine commodity worth collecting, sorting, weighing, pricing and shipping across the country. And almost none of that economy was ever meant to be seen. A perfectly arranged coil at a dinner party gave no hint whatsoever of the padding, the borrowed combings or the carefully drawn switch quietly doing the structural work beneath it. The entire point, after all, was invisibility. Fashion asked for volume and height, but it never once asked to be shown exactly how that volume and height had actually been achieved. Does that surprise you even a little? We tend to imagine the past as somehow more honest about these things, more accepting of natural limitation, when the truth, at least here, points rather firmly in the opposite direction. An entire hidden industry existed specifically to help women hide the fact that their hair required any help at all. Modern hair extensions sold today under bright lighting in salons with glossy price lists taped to the mirror are really doing nothing especially new. They are simply doing out in the open exactly what a small porcelain dish beside Charlotte's mirror once did in complete and total secrecy, which raises a rather curious question worth sitting with as we move forward. If a woman's own gathered combing sorted and drawn with such patience were not always enough to satisfy what fashion demanded of her, where precisely did the rest of that hair come from? Because somebody somewhere further down that same supply chain, stretching from a rural cottage to a fashionable dressing room, had once been growing hair of her own hair that eventually found its way into a stranger's carefully arranged crown for reasons that had very little to do with fashion and rather more to do with simple necessity. Let us leave Charlotte's dressing room for a little while and travel somewhere considerably less comfortable. Not across an ocean, not even particularly far by carriage, simply down a few steps in circumstance to a small farm labourer's cottage on the far edge of a different English county, entirely where a young woman named Nell was about to make a decision that would answer rather completely the question we ended on a moment ago. The cottage held one main room downstairs, a small fire kept low to conserve fuel, and a narrow ladder leading up to the loft space where Nell slept alongside two younger sisters. Nothing about the morning felt especially unusual at first. Porridge on the fire, a baby crying somewhere behind a thin curtain, her father's empty chair still pulled near the hearth, where he used to sit before the accident. It was in nearly every visible respect an entirely ordinary morning in an entirely ordinary household, right up until the moment a small hand mirror was passed across the table, and Nell was asked gently to take down her hair. Nell was 19 years old, the eldest of 5 children, and her hair, when she finally unpinned it that particular morning, fell nearly to her waist, thick, dark, and entirely untouched by scissors since childhood. It was by any measure of the era a truly valuable head of hair. Not valuable in the sentimental sense Charlotte's own family might have understood the word. Valuable in a far more literal, far more immediate sense, the kind that could be exchanged that very same week for actual coin. Because travelling hair buyers were a familiar sight across rural England and much of the European countryside throughout this period, men who moved from village to village, market to market, offering cash in hand for a woman's long healthy hair. Some worked independently, others represented larger firms back in the city gathering raw material for the very same switches, wigs and hairpieces that eventually turned up weeks or months later in a mail-order catalogue or a fashionable hairdresser's shop window, sold to a woman who would very likely never learn a single detail about whose head that hair had originally grown upon. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. Have you ever sold something deeply personal, not because you particularly wanted to part with it, but because the money mattered more right then than sentiment could afford to? A treasured possession, perhaps pawned quietly during a difficult month. If so, you already understand something of what brought Nell to that particular decision on that particular morning, standing in front of a cracked hand mirror, with a stranger waiting patiently in the front room below. Nell's father had taken a bad fall from a hay cart earlier that spring, and the family's small income had grown considerably smaller in the months since, while the number of mouths requiring feeding had rather inconveniently remained exactly the same. When word passed through the village that a hair buyer had arrived and set up for the afternoon near the church, Nell's mother had mentioned it only once, gently, almost apologetically, and Nell had simply nodded already, understanding perfectly well what was being asked of her, without either of them needing to say the actual words aloud. Growing hair to a length worth selling was never a quick undertaking, and this is where the entire trade grows, rather more interesting than most people today would ever guess. Human hair left entirely untouched tends to grow somewhere between 4 and 6 inches across a full year, which meant a truly valuable length. Anything approaching 20 inches or more, the sort fetching real money from a buyer, required patience measured not in months but in years. Some buyers, understanding this reality perfectly well, actually offered women small advance payments, a portion of money handed over immediately in exchange for a promise the buyer would return in 3 or 4 years to collect the hair once it had finally grown long enough to be worth the trip back. It was in its own peculiar way an early form of an arrangement we might recognize today under an entirely different name. A young woman receiving a small sum against hair she had not yet finished growing was effectively borrowing against her own future self, trusting that whatever circumstances awaited her 3 or 4 years down the road would still allow her to honour a bargain struck when she was considerably younger and considerably more uncertain about what those years might actually bring. Some buyers kept careful little notebooks recording exactly which household owed which length of hair, and roughly when it might be ready for collection, travelling the very same circuit of villages year after year, checking in on their long-term investments, the way a farmer might check on a young orchard not yet ready to bear fruit. Nell's own hair had taken the better part of 4 patient years to reach its current length. Years she had spent entirely unaware it was quietly becoming a small, slow-growing investment, sitting right there on top of her own head. She had certainly never planned to sell it. It had simply grown the way hair does without asking anyone's permission or intention until circumstances arrived that made cutting it off and accepting a stranger's coin feel like the only sensible choice remaining to her. The buyer, a brisk business-like man Nell's mother had dealt with once before years earlier, over a neighbour's hair examined the length and thickness with practised fingers, before naming his price a handful of coins that felt to Nell both surprisingly generous and quietly heartbreaking all at once. He worked quickly and without any particular ceremony, the way a man handles a transaction he has completed hundreds of times before, in hundreds of similar kitchens. The cutting itself took only a minute or two, her long braid severed cleanly near the base of her neck and coiled carefully into the buyer's leather satchel, alongside several others collected earlier that same week, each one presumably carrying its own quiet story. He had neither the time nor the particular interest to ask after. Nell touched the back of her newly shortened hair, afterward feeling strange and suddenly lighter, in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual weight involved. Would you have made the same choice in her position with a father unable to work and 3 younger siblings watching from the doorway? It is easy from the comfortable distance of another century to imagine ourselves holding firm to sentiment over necessity. It is rather harder to say the same with real confidence standing in that particular kitchen, coins already promised, a family already counting on the outcome before the scissors had even been lifted. It is worth pausing here to consider just how large this particular trade truly became by the middle of the century. Human hair, by several contemporary accounts, was valued at roughly twice its own weight in silver, a startling comparison when you actually stop to picture it, an ordinary substance growing quietly on every single head in England, somehow commanding a price rivaling precious metal. In a single year during the early 1850s, records show over £10,000 in weight of human hair crossing from France into England, alone valued at several £1,000s, sterling, a truly enormous sum for what was at its origin simply hair grown on the heads of ordinary working women exactly like Nell. France, as it happens, supplied a remarkable share of Europe's hair trade throughout this period, its rural peasant women forming one of the largest single sources feeding the entire continent's growing appetite for switches, wigs and hair pieces. The whole arrangement formed a quiet, largely invisible supply chain stretching from a cottage exactly like Nell's, through buyers' dealers and processing workshops all the way to a fashionable dressing table in a country house very much like Charlotte's own. Trust understandably became a genuine concern throughout this entire chain. A buyer paying good money for a promised braid years in advance had every reason to worry the seller might change her mind or, worse, substitute someone else's inferior hair at the moment of collection. Customers on the receiving end meanwhile worried about precisely the opposite problem, paying a premium price for hair advertised as genuine and healthy, only to receive something quietly mixed with coarser horsehair, or gathered from far less careful sources than the seller claimed. More than one dealer earned a reputation whispered about among wig-makers and hairdressers in the larger cities for occasionally passing off animal hair as human when a customer seemed unlikely to examine the purchase too closely. A woman purchasing a switch through the post, trusting entirely to a printed sample card and a stranger's written promise, had no real way of confirming what actually arrived in the parcel until it was already sitting in her own hands, by which point a complaint sent back through the mail rarely accomplished very much at all. Entire reputations on both sides of the transaction rested on nothing sturdier than an honest handshake and a buyer's willingness to return to the very same village a second time. Certain regions built their entire local economy around managing this trust problem more carefully than most. Parts of Sweden in particular became known for supplying dependable, well-sourced hair. Entire villages where the work of buying, sorting, and eventually weaving hair into finished pieces passed down through families as a genuine trade not so different from a village known for its weaving or its pottery. Women from these communities sometimes travelled considerable distances themselves, carrying carefully documented hair directly to wealthier clients, offering the kind of personal guarantee no anonymous parcel through the post could ever quite match. A buyer who knew exactly which village and very often exactly which family her hair had come from could trust its quality in a way ordinary catalogue shopping simply could not replicate. Now here is something rather telling about how this whole trade began to shift as the century wore on, and it says a great deal about changing ambitions among working women themselves. As increasing numbers of young country women left farm labour behind for positions in domestic service, working in households not unlike Charlotte's, they found themselves surrounded day after day by exactly the kind of fashionable ideas that had once felt entirely out of reach. Bonnets and hats requiring loosely dressed hair beneath them grew newly desirable. A young housemaid increasingly wanted her own long hair intact, arranged in whatever modest imitation of her mistress's style she could manage rather than exchanged for a handful of coins and a suddenly shortened neckline. The supply of sellable hair quite gradually began drying up from exactly the direction it had once flowed most freely. Not because women had grown wealthier exactly, but because their own sense of what their hair was worth, worn rather than sold, had begun quietly changing shape. Nell herself, several years later, would take a position very much like the one just described, working as a housemaid in a household, perhaps not so different from Charlotte's own. Her hair grew back slowly as hair does, and she never sold it again. Not because she could not have used the money on more than one difficult occasion afterward, but because something about that first decision made so young, in a room with a stranger waiting patiently downstairs, stayed with her in a way that made the second refusal feel considerably easier than the first sale ever had. There is a strange, quiet symmetry worth sitting with as this particular story closes. Somewhere in a fashionable dressing room very much like Charlotte's own, a woman ran her fingers through a switch, purchased months earlier from a respectable catalogue, admiring its length, its colour, its convincing thickness, with absolutely no way of knowing whose years of patient growing, whose family's difficult spring, whose own quiet heartbreak over a mirror and a pair of scissors had made that particular length of hair possible in the first place. Fashion, it turns out, rarely bothers introducing its raw materials to the women who eventually wear them. Two women, an ocean of circumstance apart, despite living perhaps within a single day's train journey of one another, connected by nothing more than a few careful stitches and a length of hair. Neither of them would ever discuss with the other, because neither of them would ever have the slightest reason to know the other existed at all. Not every strand of hair changing hands throughout this era ended its journey pinned invisibly inside somebody else's fashionable coiffure, though. Some travelled toward an entirely different destination altogether, transformed not into hidden padding meant to disappear from view, but into something meant to be seen worn openly and treasured for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with fashion, and everything to do with memory and loss and love. There was a small brooch Charlotte's grandmother wore in that very first portrait hanging in the upstairs corridor, one Charlotte had walked past 100 times without ever really looking closely at it. Oval-edged in gold, sitting neatly at the collar of her grandmother's dress. It was only recently standing there a little longer than usual that Charlotte finally leaned in near enough to notice what filled the small glass window at its centre. Not a painted miniature, not a cut stone. Hair. Carefully woven plaited hair arranged into a pattern so fine it looked from any distance almost like delicate embroidery. She had asked her mother about it that same evening over supper, half expecting some brief practical answer she would forget within the hour. Instead, her mother had set down her fork entirely and spoken for the better part of 10 minutes about a grandfather. Charlotte had never once met a man who had died young, long before Charlotte herself was born, leaving behind a widow, several small children and one careful little brooch woven from his own hair, kept near for the remainder of a lifetime that continued for decades without him. Have you ever owned something for years before finally understanding what it actually was? A ring passed down through the family, perhaps, whose real meaning nobody thought to explain until you asked the right question at exactly the right moment. Charlotte had worn a small locket herself since childhood, tucked into a drawer more often than around her neck, without ever once considering that the coiled lock inside it belonged to a particular chapter of a much larger, much older tradition, one that treated a person's actual hair as something worth wearing, preserving and passing down for generations. Making jewellery from human hair was, by the time Charlotte's grandmother sat for that portrait, already a considerably old practice in England, reaching back well over a century before either of them had been born. But it was during the reign of the very same young queen who had set the tone for that plain, dignified hairstyle we discussed earlier, that hairwork truly became something bordering on a national obsession, touching households across every level of society from farm cottages to royal palaces alike. The turning point, if you had to name a single moment, arrived in the winter of 1861 when the Queen's own husband died, rather suddenly leaving her in a grief so profound and so publicly visible that it reshaped mourning customs across the entire country for decades afterward. She wore black for the rest of her own long life, a mourning period that would eventually stretch across 4 full decades, considerably longer than the traditional year or two most widows of the period were expected to observe. She kept his rooms prepared each morning as though he might still walk through the door, his clothes laid out hot water, brought for shaving that would never happen. And she treasured among her many private mementos small pieces of jewellery containing his hair worn near her own skin, as though some part of him remained physically present whenever she needed him most. What the Queen did privately, an entire nation soon followed publicly and rather enthusiastically. Wearing a small piece of a departed loved one's actual hair transformed into something beautiful enough for polite company, became less an eccentric personal choice and more an expected, almost obligatory gesture of proper grief. A widow without some piece of hairwork jewellery to her name might have seemed to her more traditional neighbours somehow insufficiently devoted to her husband's memory. Entire shops in the larger cities began advertising themselves specifically as mourning warehouses, stocking not only hairwork but black crepe, black-bordered stationery and every other visible signal a household in grief was expected to display. An entire commercial industry, quietly built on the back of the Queen's own very public sorrow. Here is where the craft itself grows rather more fascinating than simple sentiment alone. This was not, in most cases, hair simply tucked behind glass and left alone. Skilled hands, often belonging to the woman doing the mourning herself, worked that hair into genuine, deliberate artistry, and the range of technique available to her was considerably wider than most people today would ever guess. One popular technique, sometimes called table work, involved weaving individual strands of hair around a small wooden mould, using a technique borrowed almost directly from lace-making threads of hair, carried across a padded cushion, following a pattern held in place with pins producing delicate chains and patterns strong enough to be worn as an actual bracelet once the mould was carefully removed. A second technique, known as gimp work, twisted hair tightly around a fine wire core, creating a stiffer, more sculptural material that could be bent and shaped into flowers, leaves, or small decorative curls mounted afterward onto a brooch or pendant, much the way a jeweller might mount a cut stone. Palette work, a third and rather more delicate approach, still ground hair down finely and mixed it with pigment to paint miniature scenes directly onto ivory or card a weeping willow, bending gracefully over a small stone urn, perhaps rendered entirely from someone's actual hair rather than ordinary paint, similar enough in appearance to a conventional watercolour that a stranger glancing casually at the finished piece would likely never guess its true material at all. Would you have the patience for that kind of work, do you think, sitting for hours with tweezers and a small wooden form weaving a chain from something as fine and slippery as a single strand of hair? Because plenty of grieving women apparently did treating the slow, exacting labour almost as a form of quiet devotion in itself. Each careful loop a small private ritual stretched out across many long evenings, rather than completed in one single sitting. There was perhaps something almost merciful buried inside that slowness, a grieving widow given somewhere specific to direct her hands and her attention during exactly the kind of long, empty evenings that otherwise might have felt unbearable to sit through alone. Not every woman felt equal to the task herself, of course, and this is precisely where the whole arrangement grew rather more complicated than it first appears. A widow without the necessary skill, or simply without the time, could send a lock of her husband's hair away to a professional workshop specializing in exactly this kind of memorial work. And this is where trust once again became a truly serious concern, though, for reasons considerably more painful this time than a switch bought slightly too dark or too coarse. Because the entire point of mourning jewellery was possessing a literal physical piece of one particular irreplaceable person. If a careless or dishonest workshop quietly substituted a stranger's hair for the customer's own precious parcel, whether through simple carelessness or deliberate shortcuts to save time, the resulting piece, beautifully crafted or not, would be nothing more than an elegant lie worn directly against a grieving widow's heart, and she would very likely never have any way of knowing. This particular fear grew common enough that instructional manuals began appearing specifically to help women avoid it altogether, teaching the necessary techniques so a grieving family member could work with complete confidence that the hair inside their finished piece truly belonged to the person they were mourning. One widely circulated guide, published in the late 1860s, walked readers through each individual technique in careful, patient detail, transforming what had once been considered a specialized professional skill into something any determined woman could learn to practice safely inside her own home, with her own hands and her own trusted materials. Its author addressed his readers directly, almost as though writing to a friend rather than a stranger, reassuring nervous beginners that a first attempt need not be perfect, only sincere, and that steady practice would carry even a clumsy pair of hands toward genuine skill within a reasonably short stretch of time. Copies of that same guide were still being consulted, quietly passed between neighbours and sisters, well into the decade Charlotte herself was currently living through. The finished pieces themselves carried their own quiet visual language, one an observant Victorian eye could recognise almost instantly, the way we might glance at a wedding ring today, and immediately understand its meaning without a single word being spoken. Black enamel bordering a piece signalled mourning for someone who'd been married. White enamel rather more poignantly marked mourning for someone who had died unmarried, often a young person whose life had been cut short before certain milestones ever arrived. Certain symbols appeared again and again across these pieces, a weeping willow bent low, an urn draped in fabric. Small forget-me-not flowers, rendered in delicate detail, each one a small agreed-upon piece of vocabulary, within a shared cultural language of grief that required no explanation among people who understood it. A woman calling at a neighbour's house for the first time since a death in the family could glance once at a brooch pinned to her hostess's collar, and know before a single word of condolence had even been exchanged roughly who had been lost, and how recently. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine hairwork as purely a craft of sorrow. Plenty of these same techniques served considerably happier purposes too. A young woman exchanging a lock of her own hair with a sweetheart preparing to leave on a long sea voyage, a token meant to travel with him and remind him of exactly what waited faithfully at home, was practicing precisely the same craft, using precisely the same patient weaving technique in service of hope rather than loss. A young man might carry such a token tucked inside his coat for years through storms, foreign ports, and long months of silence with no letters reaching him, a small woven promise that someone somewhere was still waiting for his return. Friendship, too, sometimes called for exactly this kind of gift. Two devoted friends exchanging small woven tokens before a long separation neither particularly wanted to face. An ordinary schoolroom farewell transformed into something considerably more solemn, through nothing more than a shared pair of scissors and a little patience. Royalty itself understood this dual purpose rather well. Years before her husband's death turned mourning jewellery into something bordering on a national uniform. The Queen had already exchanged hairwork bracelets with a foreign empress during a state visit in the middle of the 1850s, a small personal gesture of genuine affection between two powerful women carrying nothing whatsoever to do with grief. It is a small detail, easily lost beneath everything that followed her husband's death, but worth remembering all the same. Long before hairwork became synonymous with loss in the public imagination, it had already served quietly and sincerely as a private language between friends who happened to rule entire nations, exchanged the same way any two women might trade a small keepsake to mark a visit neither wished to forget. The very same craft, it turns out, could speak fluently in either direction, memory or affection, loss or friendship, depending entirely on the moment and the hands doing the weaving. There is something worth sitting with honestly here, something that reaches well beyond lace patterns and enamel borders. Underneath every single one of these pieces sat the very same simple human instinct we still recognize easily today. A lock of a newborn's first haircut tucked carefully inside a small envelope in a baby book. a departed grandparent's handwriting copied faithfully onto skin as a permanent tattoo. A voicemail nobody can quite bring themselves to delete, kept purely for the small aching comfort of hearing a familiar voice again. We are in this particular respect not so very different from Charlotte's own grandmother, still finding quiet physical ways of holding on to people we cannot actually hold anymore. Charlotte thought about all of this a little longer than she perhaps intended to, standing once again in front of that small oval brooch. The following afternoon, her mother's story about a grandfather she'd never met still sitting somewhere near the edge of her thoughts. She found herself wondering not unkindly what small woven piece of herself might one day sit inside some future descendant's own jewellery box worn by a granddaughter who would likely know almost nothing about her, beyond a single painted portrait and a lock of hair grown quiet and still. Decades after the hands that had once brushed it every single night had finally stopped moving altogether. Not everything a Victorian woman wore near her own hair, though, was crafted with anything resembling this kind of care and good intention. Some of what touched her scalp daily, quietly promising beauty rather than memory, carried consequences far more dangerous than anyone at the time fully understood. Not every woman in England was entirely satisfied with the colour nature had given her, and this particular little vanity, harmless enough on the surface, turns out to hide one of the more truly unsettling chapters in our entire story so far. A friend of Charlotte's from her school days, a pleasant, rather anxious young woman named Louisa, had spent years quietly unhappy with what she called her own mousy, forgettable shade of brown, convinced that a richer, warmer colour might finally earn her the kind of attention she watched other women receive without apparent effort. She'd mentioned it to Charlotte more than once over tea, always in the same slightly embarrassed tone people use when confessing to a vanity they feel they ought to have outgrown by now. What Louisa eventually reached for in pursuit of that warmer shade was rather more dangerous than she ever could have guessed. Here is a question worth turning over honestly for a moment. Have you ever used a product trusting the label completely, only to learn much later exactly what it actually contained? Most of us assume regulation and testing stand quietly behind everything sold to us today, checking, verifying, protecting us from exactly this kind of unpleasant surprise, whether it turns up in a shampoo bottle or a jar of face cream. Louisa's own century offered no such protection whatsoever. No government body inspecting formulas before they ever reached a shop shelf. No requirement that a label list its actual contents in any language a customer could understand. And the results for more than one unlucky woman proved considerably worse than simply disappointing. Recipe books circulating through fashionable households at the time, guides covering everything from perfume to complexion powders, occasionally included instructions for darkening or lightening hair at home, and more than a few of these recipes called for arsenic worked directly into the mixture without a second thought. It sounds almost unbelievable today, arsenic sitting comfortably beside rosewater and glycerin on the very same printed page, yet published guides from the period plainly list it as an ingredient for both hair treatments and complexion washes, discussed with the same calm, practical tone used for any ordinary household recipe. A woman consulting such a guide had no particular reason to feel alarmed. The recipe sat printed in the very same book she trusted for advice on everything from removing ink stains to preserving fruit for winter, lending it an air of ordinary domestic respectability that a truly dangerous substance rarely receives today. Louisa herself never attempted to mix anything at home. She preferred, as many women increasingly did by this point in the century, the convenience of a ready-made bottle purchased directly from a chemist shop, trusting the manufacturer's expertise over her own uncertain hand with unfamiliar measurements. It felt to her like the more sensible choice, leaving something as important as her own appearance to professionals who presumably understood exactly what they were doing. Commercial products fared little better, and in certain respects proved considerably worse, since a woman purchasing a bottle from a shop counter had no way whatsoever of examining what actually sat inside it, beyond whatever claims the label happened to print. Several of the most popular hair restorers sold across the later decades of the century owed their actual colouring power to a rather unglamorous pairing acetate of lead combined with something called lacy sulphur, worked together into a solution that gradually darkened greying or faded hair with repeated regular use. Sold under names promising vigour restoration and vitality, these products rarely announced themselves honestly as dye at all. Many advertised, in fact, that they contained nothing dangerous or harmful whatsoever, language printed directly beside an ingredient we now understand to be truly toxic to the human body. Think about that particular contradiction for a moment, because it deserves real attention. A bottle promising in confident printed letters that it contained no uncleanly dangerous or injurious substance, while quietly built around a metal capable of entering the bloodstream through nothing more than regular contact with the scalp. It was not simply an oversight. It was in more than one documented case a deliberate choice by manufacturers who understood perfectly well what lead could do and calculated correctly, as it turned out that most customers would never think to question a confident claim printed directly on the bottle in front of them. Some manufacturers went further still, insisting their particular formula restored colour through some vague, unspecified natural process, rather than dye at all, language carefully chosen to sidestep the very word that might have made a cautious customer pause before purchasing. There was, alongside the liquids and tonics, an even simpler device sold for exactly this same purpose, one requiring no messy application at all. A comb manufactured with a core of lead running through its teeth promised to restore a greying hair to its former colour through nothing more strenuous than ordinary daily combing. No staining fingers, no waiting for a mixture to set, no unpleasant chemical smell lingering in the dressing room. Simply comb morning and evening exactly the way any woman already brushed her hair, as a matter of routine, and watch grey gradually give way to a more youthful shade over the following weeks. Advertisements for these combs leaned heavily on exactly that sense of effortlessness. Picturing a contented woman seated calmly at her mirror, comb in hand, going about her ordinary evening routine with no hint whatsoever that anything unusual was taking place. It was in its own quietly troubling way a rather brilliant piece of design, disguising a genuine health hazard as the most unremarkable familiar gesture imaginable, indistinguishable in the hand from any ordinary comb sitting beside it on the very same dressing table. A visiting guest glancing casually across a dressing room would have absolutely no way of telling a lead comb apart from a perfectly ordinary one carved from bone or tortoise shell. That particular invisibility in hindsight may well have been the single most dangerous feature of the entire product, allowing a truly hazardous item to sit in plain sight for years, treated with exactly the same casual familiarity as any harmless household object. Physicians writing for medical journals of the period did not stay entirely silent on the matter, and this is worth pausing on because it corrects a rather common assumption people carry about the past. We tend to imagine earlier generations as simply ignorant, stumbling blindly into danger nobody could possibly have understood at the time. The truth sits rather differently. Warnings truly existed, published plainly in medical literature, describing lead absorbed gradually through the scalp as capable of producing sharp nerve pain, persistent irritability, and severe cramping through the stomach and bowels. Painters working daily with lead-based materials had already been suffering from these exact symptoms for decades, a connection some physicians drew explicitly pointing directly at popular hair products as carrying precisely the same risk into an entirely different, considerably more intimate corner of ordinary domestic life. One physician documented a case of partial facial paralysis he traced directly back to habitual use of a popular hair restorer, a serious lasting injury connected quite explicitly to nothing more than a woman's ordinary effort to look a little younger than her years. These warnings were not whispered quietly among a handful of specialists either. Some appeared in publications aimed specifically at concerned households, plainly worded articles carrying titles blunt enough to leave little room for misunderstanding, urging readers directly to abandon so-called hair restorers altogether, rather than risk the slow cumulative poisoning several popular brands were now known to cause. And yet remarkably sales of these very same products continued largely unaffected for years afterward, a stubborn gap between what careful published science was steadily uncovering and what ordinary households actually believed, or perhaps simply preferred to believe about the little bottle sitting on their own dressing table. So why, you might reasonably ask, did women keep buying these products anyway, warnings and all? Part of the answer sits in something rather familiar even now. A confident advertisement printed boldly across a newspaper page tends to reach considerably more readers than a cautious warning tucked away inside a specialized medical journal few ordinary households ever actually saw. Louisa herself never encountered a single word of medical caution regarding her chosen hair treatment. She saw only the advertisement promising a rich, natural-looking colour and complete satisfaction tucked between an advertisement for scented soap and one for a new style of parasol entirely unremarkable in its placement, entirely convincing in its confident, cheerful tone. Louisa's own experience thankfully never grew as severe as that documented case of facial paralysis. What she did notice gradually over several months of regular use was a persistent nagging headache she could never quite trace to any obvious cause, along with an unpleasant metallic taste that occasionally surfaced without warning. Symptoms she mentioned to almost nobody, assuming, as many women likely did, that mild discomfort was simply the ordinary, unremarkable price of vanity, rather than a genuine warning sign worth taking seriously. She confided in Charlotte once, rather sheepishly, that she'd begun wondering privately whether the headaches were somehow connected to her new hair colour, before dismissing the thought entirely as foolish, embarrassed at herself for even briefly entertaining such an unlikely idea. It was only years later, once wider public understanding of Leeds' dangers had finally caught up with what certain physicians had been quietly documenting all along, that Louisa herself made the connection and gave up the particular bottle sitting on her own dressing table for good, throwing it away with rather more relief than regret. Does any of this sound entirely unfamiliar to you? Or does it perhaps ring a rather uncomfortable bell? We like to imagine ourselves living in a considerably safer, better regulated era, and in many genuine respects we absolutely do. And yet plenty of modern cosmetic ingredients remain the subject of real ongoing scientific debate. Substances permitted in one country's regulations and quietly banned in another, marketed today with precisely the same confident, reassuring language once printed beside acetate of lead. A bottle on a shelf today might promise to be clean or natural or free from harsh chemicals, phrases that sound reassuring without necessarily meaning very much at all, once you start asking exactly what standard, if any, sits behind them. Perhaps that is the more enduring lesson hidden in these old dressing rooms. Beauty fashions change, ingredients change, and our understanding of their effects becomes more sophisticated with time. But people have always had to make choices using the knowledge available to them. What appears perfectly ordinary in one generation may look rather different when examined by the next. For the women who used these products, there was rarely anything reckless or extraordinary about the decision. They were simply following familiar routines, trusting the advice advertisements, and accepted wisdom surrounding them, often without any obvious reason to suspect that an everyday object on the dressing table deserved a second thought. Charlotte herself fortunately never felt any particular pull toward dyeing her own dark hair, contented enough with the shade she'd been given at birth to avoid the entire question altogether. But she thought of Louisa often in later years, and of that quietly troubling comb sitting so innocently beside an ordinary hairbrush, indistinguishable to the eye, entirely different in what it was actually capable of doing to the body holding it. It struck her more than once how strange it was that something so small, so ordinary, so completely woven into the daily rhythm of getting dressed, could carry a danger nobody thought to question, simply because it had always sat there unremarkable on the very same dressing table. Not every woman worried about dye and colour purely for fashion's sake, though, the way Louisa once had. As the years moved steadily forward and Charlotte herself grew older, along with everyone else in this story, an entirely different, considerably more personal fear began creeping into dressing rooms across the country, one that had far less to do with achieving a fashionable new shade, and rather more to do with quietly, desperately trying to hold on to the one a woman had always known as her own. By then Charlotte had spent so many mornings before the same familiar mirror that the ritual seemed almost untouched by time. Agnes was still there behind her too, her own hair now threaded with grey and her once quick hands moving with a gentler, more deliberate rhythm. The formality that had marked their younger years had long since softened into easy companionship, and their mornings were usually filled with quiet conversation as Agnes brushed and arranged Charlotte's hair. On one such morning, however, the familiar rhythm faltered. Agnes slowed the brush near Charlotte's temple, then stopped altogether, her attention caught by something she had not noticed before. There, catching the morning light in a way ordinary brown hair never quite managed, sat a small cluster of unmistakably silver strands, perhaps a dozen of them arriving all at once, as though they had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to announce themselves. Agnes said nothing at first, simply holding the brush still for a beat longer than necessary, and Charlotte, catching her own reflection's eye in the mirror, understood immediately what her old friend had spotted without a single word needing to pass between them. Charlotte stared at her own reflection for a long moment, feeling something considerably more complicated than simple vanity, an odd mixture of curiosity, a faint pang of something bordering on grief, and rather to her own surprise a small measure of quiet acceptance sitting somewhere underneath it all. Have you ever noticed your first grey hair, or watched someone dear to you discover their own, and felt that same strange layered reaction? Part fascination, part something considerably harder to name. For a Victorian woman, that particular reaction rarely stayed simple for long, because an entire industry stood ready and waiting to transform one small, ordinary biological fact into something requiring immediate, urgent correction. By the later decades of the century, newspaper pages carried advertisement after advertisement for so-called hair restorers, each one competing loudly for the exact same anxious customer, promising to return grey hair to its former glory through nothing more troubling than regular faithful application. These advertisements rarely wasted space on modest claims. Testimonials printed in bold type described women decades younger, looking husbands astonished at dinner tables, strangers on the street mistaking a middle-aged mother for her own unmarried daughter. Each story slightly more dramatic than the one printed beside it, competing not merely for a customer's coin, but for the very small, precious space inside her own imagination, where hope for a different outcome still quietly lived. The sheer number of competing brands says a great deal about how large this particular fear had grown by this point. Chevalier's Life for the Hair sat on the very same chemist's shelf as Hall's vegetable Sicilian hair renewer itself, competing directly against something called Ring's Vegetable Ambrosia and a widely trusted formula known simply as Ayer's Hair Vigor, each brand insisting in its own particular language that it alone held the genuine secret other lesser products merely imitated. Dozens more crowded the very same market, each with its own confident name and its own devoted following, a customer in one town swearing entirely by a brand her neighbour, 2 streets over, had never even heard mentioned. A woman standing in front of that shelf faced with a dozen confidently worded bottles, all claiming precisely the same miracle, could easily have spent an entire morning simply trying to decide which particular promise to believe, each label competing for exactly the same anxious moment of hesitation in front of the mirror. Here is where the marketing itself grows rather cleverer than you might expect, and worth examining closely for what it reveals about persuasion generally. Ayer's Hair Vigor, one of the most successful and longest running of these products, patented toward the end of the 1860s, advertised itself with a rather remarkable claim. It restored grey hair to its natural vitality and colour, the label insisted, while simultaneously promising it did not colour the hair at all. Sit with that particular sentence for a moment, because it deserves real appreciation as a small masterpiece of careful wording. The product would change your hair's colour quite plainly, yet the manufacturer refused outright to call this dyeing, preferring instead the gentler, more scientific-sounding language of restoration and vitality, as though grey hair were simply a temporary illness. The formula was nobly curing rather than a natural expected part of growing older. The very same advertisement promised, further still, that the formula was free from anything uncleanly dangerous or injurious, and would additionally cure dandruff and stop hair from falling, a rather ambitious list of promises for a single small bottle to carry. That distinction, restoration rather than dye, mattered enormously to the customers buying it. A respectable Victorian woman purchasing an obvious dye risked a certain kind of social judgment, an implication of vanity, of trying too hard, of refusing to accept her own natural aging with appropriate grace. A woman purchasing a restorative tonic, by contrast, framed her purchase as a matter of health rather than vanity, restoring something nature had simply temporarily misplaced, rather than covering up an inconvenient truth about her own advancing years. The product inside the bottle may well have worked identically either way. The story printed on the label made all the difference in how a woman felt about buying it, and about herself for wanting to allowing her to walk out of the chemist's shop with her head held rather higher than a plainly labelled bottle of dye would ever have permitted. Some of these companies grew considerably cleverer still in how they reach potential customers. One particularly successful manufacturer distributed a small annual almanac packed with truly useful information, weather predictions, planting schedules, small household tips a farming family might actually consult throughout the year, tucked quietly around advertisements and testimonials for the very same company's hair and health products. Household kept that little almanac pinned near the kitchen door for practical reference, glancing at it regularly, for reasons having nothing whatsoever to do with hair colour, while the manufacturer's name and promises sat quietly embedded in nearly every single page, absorbed almost unconsciously through sheer repeated familiarity, rather than any single dramatic advertisement. Does that particular strategy sound at all familiar to you, dressed up in slightly different clothing? A free publication truly useful on its own terms, quietly carrying a persuasive message alongside whatever practical value first drew you toward picking it up. We still encounter versions of exactly this same technique constantly, though we now tend to call it something else entirely: content marketing or a loyalty newsletter, rather than a farmer's almanac tucked beside the kitchen door. Charlotte considered all of this rather carefully, standing at her own mirror that particular morning, weighing her small cluster of silver strands against everything she had come to understand over the years about products promising more than they honestly delivered. She thought almost immediately of Louisa, and of that quietly troubling comb, and of headaches dismissed for months as simply the ordinary, unremarkable price of vanity, rather than a genuine warning worth taking seriously. She thought, too, of her own comfortable position, a settled marriage, a secure household, none of the particular financial urgency that pushed so many other women toward that crowded competing shelf of bottles in the first place, and found herself grateful quietly for a choice that felt considerably easier to make from where she happened to be standing than it would have from somewhere else. In the end, Charlotte chose not to reach for any bottle at all. Instead, she asked Agnes to bring the small bundle of dried rosemary she still kept in the corner of her dressing room, the very same herb she'd relied on for years between proper washing, steeping a fresh rinse, and working it gently through her hair, the way she always had, more out of familiar habit than any real conviction it would slow what was already quite naturally underway. It would not, of course, actually reverse a single grey strand, but it asked nothing dangerous of her body in return, and that particular trade weighed honestly against everything she now understood, felt like the wiser bargain by a considerable margin. Not every woman reached the very same conclusion, and it would be unfair, honestly, to judge too harshly those who chose differently. The pressure to appear youthful carried real, tangible consequences in Victorian society, considerably more severe for some women than others. An unmarried woman past a certain age, or a widow hoping to remarry, faced a marriage market that valued youthful appearance rather bluntly, and a visible head of grey hair could quietly work against her prospects in ways a modern reader might find uncomfortably familiar. Newspaper advice columns of the period occasionally addressed exactly this anxiety, directly gently reassuring anxious readers that character and grace mattered more than a few silver strands, kindly worded columns, tucked more often than not onto the very same page, carrying an advertisement for the exact product supposedly rendered unnecessary by that same reassuring advice. Whether readers noticed the small irony sitting side by side on that single sheet of newsprint comfort on one column and temptation on the next, history does not particularly record, though it seems reasonable enough to assume more than one woman did. For women in that particular position, the risk printed in small type on the back of a bottle may well have seemed reasonably enough considerably smaller than the risk of being quietly passed over, entirely overlooked at precisely the moment financial security depended on being noticed. Is the underlying instinct here really so distant from our own moment, when entire aisles of any modern shop remain devoted to exactly the same fundamental promise, turning back a clock nobody has ever actually managed to stop? The specific bottles have changed considerably, the ingredients considerably safer, the language considerably more scientific sounding still. The particular fear driving a hand toward the shelf, and the story a woman tells herself about why she reached for it, has proven rather more stubborn than any single ingredient banned or replaced along the way. Charlotte's own silver strands multiplied steadily over the following years, entirely unbothered by rosemary or restraint or anything else she tried, the way grey hair generally is. What she gained instead, watching them slowly spread through hair that had once required an entire hour, and Agnes's steady hands to arrange each morning, was something considerably harder to bottle and sell, a quiet, hard-won comfort with her own reflection built slowly across decades, rather than purchased in a single confident bottle from a crowded chemist's shelf. It occurred to her standing there that particular morning with Agnes still waiting patiently behind her, that she had spent this entire story so far describing her own hair, her own choices, her own quiet reckonings with vanity and fear and passing time, and yet not one single hour of it, not the brushing, the washing, the curling, the styling had ever actually been performed by her own two hands alone. Somebody else's hands had done the real physical labor of every single morning and evening we've shared together so far. Hands belonging to a woman whose own story, whose own hair, whose own aging reflection in whatever small mirror she kept in her own quarters had barely been mentioned at all across this entire journey together. That particular silence, now that Charlotte finally noticed it standing there in front of her own greying reflection, felt considerably harder to ignore than any advertisement promising to erase it. Charlotte actually asked her that same morning standing there with her own grey hair still catching the light in the mirror between them. Simply gently, the way you might finally ask a question you realise rather uncomfortably you should have asked decades earlier. What did your own hair look like, Agnes, when you were young? Agnes laughed, a little surprised by the question, and set the brush down for a moment before answering, a pause long enough that Charlotte briefly wondered whether she had somehow overstepped some quiet unspoken boundary the two of them had maintained without either of them ever discussing it directly. Her own hair, Agnes said eventually, had never once required an hour of anyone's careful attention. A single thick plait twisted quickly into a simple knot each morning before dawn, done alone by feel in whatever light happened to be available at that particular hour, finished in considerably less time than it took Charlotte simply to decide which ribbon suited her mood that day. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. Have you ever spent real time and care on someone else's appearance? Their home, their comfort, while your own particular corner of the world went almost entirely unattended, a parent tending endlessly to a child's needs, while their own hair goes unbrushed for days, a caregiver managing everyone else's schedule, while quietly neglecting their own health entirely. Agnes had spent nearly 30 years perfecting exactly this kind of quiet imbalance, and she had never once in all that time thought to describe it as unfair. It was simply the shape her working life had taken, the way water finds whatever channel already sits waiting for it. Agnes had learned the work gradually, as many women in domestic service did not through formal lessons but through observation, repetition, and years spent working beside someone more experienced. In her earliest position, an older lady's maid had shown her how to arrange hair handle pins and ribbons, care for delicate clothing, and eventually use the heated curling irons required for more elaborate styles. There had been mistakes along the way, of course, followed by corrections practice and the slow confidence that comes from performing the same difficult tasks hundreds of times. What might have appeared from outside to be a collection of ordinary dressing room routines was in reality a considerable body of practical knowledge. By the time Agnes became an experienced lady's maid herself, that knowledge had become one of the things that distinguished her position within the household and gave her work a value readily recognized by both employers and other servants. A skilled lady's maid, by most household accounts of the period, could expect to earn considerably more than a general housemaid working in that very same household, sometimes nearly double the wage, a meaningful difference reflecting exactly how specialized her particular labor actually was. Dressing hair, properly understanding fashion well enough to advise a mistress on what actually suited her, managing delicate fabrics, occasionally even serving as a trusted confidant through a mistress's private worries, required a considerably broader set of skills than scrubbing a floor or blacking a grate, and household budgets quietly but consistently reflected exactly that difference. A position as lady's maid once earned was widely understood among servants themselves as something worth genuine ambition, a small but meaningful step upward within a world offering working women rather few such steps to begin with. Think about that particular arrangement for a moment, because it says something rather pointed about how skill and intimacy were valued inside a Victorian household. Agnes was in many respects entrusted with something considerably more personal than any other servant in the house. She saw Charlotte's hair completely undone every single evening. She heard whatever quiet worry or small triumph happened to be sitting behind Charlotte's expression that particular day, since an hour spent standing perfectly still in front of a mirror rarely passes in complete silence between two people who have shared a room together for decades. She knew better than almost anyone else alive exactly how Charlotte's shoulders sat when she was anxious about a coming dinner, exactly which particular silence meant grief rather than simple tiredness. And yet, for all that closeness, an entire wall of social distance remained firmly in place between them, one neither woman would have dreamed of questioning aloud, no matter how comfortable their daily conversation had truly become. Agnes addressed Charlotte formally always every single morning for 30 years. Charlotte, without ever quite deciding to, had somehow never once thought to ask what Agnes herself might prefer to be called, beyond the single name everyone in the household had always used. Not every household relied entirely on a live-in lady's maid for this particular kind of work either, and this is where the whole picture grows considerably more interesting. By the later decades of the century, professional hairdressing establishments had begun appearing across the larger cities' shops, where a woman without her own dedicated maid, or simply craving something more elaborate than her household staff could manage, might visit directly for a properly fashionable style ahead of an important occasion. These establishments advertised themselves in the very same ladies' magazines, carrying every other beauty product we have discussed throughout this story, promising the very latest fashionable styles executed by hands trained specifically for exactly that purpose. A service priced well beyond what an ordinary household budget could comfortably absorb on a regular basis, but well within reach for a special evening worth the expense. Rather curiously, many of these establishments were run by men professional hairdressers who built entire careers styling wealthy women's hair for important occasions, a peculiar arrangement when you consider how strictly society elsewhere insisted a woman's unbound hair belonged only to the smallest, most private circle of her own household. A gentleman caller, glimpsing a respectable woman's hair unpinned, might have caused genuine scandal in a private parlour. That very same woman seated in a public shop chair while a male hairdresser worked confidently through her loose, unbound hair, in full view of other customers waiting their turn, apparently raised no comparable concern whatsoever. Does that particular contradiction strike you as odd the way it strikes me? A stranger, a man no less permitted to handle a woman's hair professionally inside a public shop in circumstances that would have seemed scandalous almost anywhere else in her daily life. Professional distance apparently carried its own peculiar exemption from the ordinary rules, the same way a physician might be permitted certain liberties a suitor never could. Skill, or perhaps simply payment, seemed to grant a curious kind of temporary permission society rarely extended so easily in other circumstances. Agnes herself never had cause to visit any such establishment, her own skill more than sufficient for anything Charlotte's household required, and privately she confessed once rather firmly that she saw very little sense paying a stranger for something she could manage rather better herself, with rather more genuine care behind every single pin. There was real pride sitting underneath that particular confession. Charlotte realized, listening to her that morning with fresh attention, she probably should have offered decades sooner. pride in a craft mastered slowly through years of practice at an hour most of the household never witnessed at all, tucked away before dawn and again well after the last guest had gone home for the evening, a skill nobody had ever once thought to complement directly the way they routinely complemented the finished result sitting on top of Charlotte's own head. Charlotte found herself asking rather carefully whether Agnes had ever wanted something different for herself, some other trade entirely away from hairpins and curling irons, and another woman's endless small vanities. Agnes considered the question longer than Charlotte expected, glancing briefly toward the window before answering, before admitting honestly that she had never particularly minded the work itself. There was a quiet satisfaction, she said, in a style well made a mistress pleased with her own reflection. A difficult evening navigated successfully because the hair at least had given nobody any reason for complaint. What she'd occasionally minded quietly across all those years was simply never being asked about it. Treated less as a woman with her own particular skill and history, and rather more as a permanent useful fixture of the room itself, present every single morning and evening without anyone thinking to wonder much about the person actually standing there. That admission sat rather heavily in the room for a moment, neither woman quite sure what to say next. Charlotte reached back almost instinctively and touched her own hair, still slightly damp from the rosemary rinse Agnes had prepared only minutes earlier, and found herself truly unable to recall a single morning across all these years when she had thought to ask Agnes a similar question before today. It would be easy looking back across this entire story so far to imagine hair care as purely a private personal matter, one woman and her mirror, her brush, her own quiet vanity. But nearly everything we have described together, the 100 nightly strokes, the careful washing, the dangerous curling irons, the elaborate braided crowns, required 2 sets of hands working in careful partnership, one giving instructions gently or not, and one following them skillfully every time across decades that shaped both women considerably more than either one most likely had ever stopped to properly notice. We rarely think of hairstyling as genuine skilled labour deserving real recognition, do we? The same careful respect we might offer a tailor or a cook, or any other trade requiring years of patient practice to master properly. Perhaps that particular blindness says rather more about which kinds of work society has traditionally chosen to notice, and which kinds it has simply expected quietly, without much thought or gratitude from the women standing closest and most faithfully behind the mirror. A cook's finished dish arrives at the table to be tasted and praised directly. A tailor's finished coat is admired, examined, complimented on its cut. A lady's maid's finished work simply becomes her mistress, indistinguishable from the woman herself, the moment she steps into a room, the labour behind it disappearing entirely into the appearance it produced. Is there work in your own life, perhaps at functions rather similarly skilled, essential and almost entirely invisible the moment it succeeds? The parent who keeps an entire household running smoothly enough that nobody downstairs ever has cause to notice the effort involved. The colleague whose careful, quiet preparation makes everyone else's presentation look effortless. We tend to notice labour mainly when it fails, and rarely pause to properly credit the considerable skill required to make something difficult look consistently deceptively simple. By the time this particular conversation finally settled and Agnes returned a little more thoughtfully than usual to the small remaining tasks of the morning, something quiet and lasting had shifted between the two women. Decades into a relationship, neither had ever quite examined this directly before. Charlotte found herself over the following weeks asking small questions she never had before about Agnes's own family, her own girlhood, the particular village she'd grown up in before ever setting foot inside a grand house like this one. Nothing dramatic changed between them. The brushing continued each night exactly as it always had, 100 strokes unbroken. But something underneath it, something neither woman could have named precisely, had grown just a little warmer, a little more honestly seen. And somewhere beyond that small dressing room, beyond even Charlotte's own long eventful life, an entire system built around exactly this kind of quiet, devoted labour was already beginning slowly and almost invisibly to come apart at the seams for reasons neither woman could have fully predicted on that particular ordinary morning, reasons considerably larger than any single household, any single mistress, or any single lady's maid standing faithfully behind her. The system that gave Charlotte her 100 nightly strokes, her carefully drawn switches, her hair crown built from months of patient combings, did not collapse all at once. Nothing quite that large ever does. It came apart slowly, quietly, the way a favourite old garment finally gives out, not from any single rip, but from years of ordinary wear, finally catching up with every seam at roughly the same time. The first real crack arrived with a war nobody in Charlotte's younger years could have properly imagined, one that pulled men out of houses like hers and sent them somewhere considerably more dangerous than a ballroom. Footmen, stable hands, even a young under-gardener Charlotte had known since he was a boy, all left for uniforms rather different from anything worn in service. And with so many men suddenly gone, women found themselves stepping into factories, onto farms, into hospital wards, doing work that paid considerably better and demanded considerably more respect than standing quietly behind another woman's mirror ever had. Letters and household diaries from this exact period keep returning to the very same worried little phrase, almost as though every anxious mistress in England had somehow agreed on identical wording without ever comparing notes. The servant problem. That was what they called it, this sudden baffling difficulty finding young women willing to spend their days curling somebody else's hair when a munitions factory 2 towns over paid triple the wage for considerably more interesting work. One acquaintance of Charlotte's, a woman running a household, not unlike her own, wrote rather despairingly that she had advertised for a new lady's maid 3 separate times that particular year, and received across all 3 attempts a single solitary reply from a woman who withdrew her application the following week after a factory offered considerably better terms. Have you ever watched an entire way of doing things quietly lose its appeal not through any single dramatic event, but simply because something better finally became available to the people who'd always kept it running? That is precisely what happened here, gradually and then all at once. Technology arriving slowly across these same decades chipped away at the old system from an entirely different direction. Running water reaching more ordinary bedrooms meant no more hauling heavy jugs up narrow back staircases for a proper wash day, no more. Agnes making 4 or 5 careful trips before breakfast simply to fill a single basin. Gas and electric lighting meant fewer candles to trim fewer oil lamps, to clean less soot drifting through a household to settle stubbornly into hair and fabric alike. A new device called a vacuum cleaner began appearing in wealthier homes, doing in an afternoon what once required an entire day of beating carpets by hand. Each small invention, taken alone, seems almost too modest to matter. Taken together, they quietly erased hours upon hours of labour that had once required a full household of hands simply to keep pace with an ordinary week. Money, or rather the sudden and painful lack of it, delivered perhaps the final decisive blow. New taxes on inherited wealth landed hard on families whose fortunes existed mainly on paper, tied up in land and houses, rather than ready cash sitting conveniently in a bank. A single unexpected death in the family, once simply a private grief to be mourned quietly, with hairwork and black crape. The way we discussed earlier in this story could now trigger a tax bill large enough to threaten the entire estate a family had spent generations carefully assembling. Grand estates that had once employed dozens of servants without a second thought found themselves within a single generation unable to justify even a fraction of that same staff. Some of these houses were sold outright. Others were quietly transformed into schools or hospitals, or simply left to a single skeleton staff doing the work an entire small army had once managed together. The great house, as an entire way of organising a woman's life and everybody else's labour around her, was running out of road rather faster than anyone standing inside it had quite expected. And then, almost as though history had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment, came the single most dramatic reversal in our entire story so far, one that would have seemed nearly unthinkable to the very first portrait hanging in that quiet upstairs corridor. Young women nurses among the very first began cutting their hair short during the war years, practical necessity driving scissors through lengths that had once taken decades of careful brushing, washing, and patient collecting to build. A nurse working long, exhausting shifts in a crowded hospital ward had neither the time nor the patience for 100 nightly strokes, nor any particular desire to risk tangled, unhygienic hair anywhere near a patient's open injury. Long hair tangled and difficult to manage cleanly under those particular conditions became simply impractical rather than sacred. And once those first determined scissors had done their work, something rather remarkable happened. The style did not disappear once the immediate necessity had passed. It spread. By the years following the war, young women across England were choosing deliberately and often joyfully to cut hair many of their own mothers had spent a lifetime protecting, growing it out only far enough to shape into something short, sleek, and entirely new. Hairdressers who had once specialised exclusively in elaborate updos and careful switches found themselves retraining almost overnight, learning an entirely different set of skills built around scissors rather than pins. Think back, if you will, to where this entire story first began. A young woman's hair treated as her crowning glory, her modesty, her whole story pinned up and hidden in plain sight, rarely shown loose to anyone beyond the smallest, safest circle of her own family. Cutting it off in that world was something bordering on a small death, a punishment, a loss of self severe enough that families dreaded even a doctor's order to trim it during dangerous illness. Now here were young women choosing exactly that same cut themselves, cheerfully as an act of freedom rather than loss. The scissors had not changed. The hair had not changed. What had changed entirely and rather beautifully was what cutting it now meant. Charlotte encountered that change most clearly within her own family. One afternoon, her granddaughter arrived for a visit wearing her hair cut neatly to the chin, sleek, simple, and strikingly different from the elaborate styles that had surrounded Charlotte for most of her life. For a brief moment, the sight caught her off guard. Decades of habit and convention stirred almost automatically, carrying with them distant memories of the rules that had once governed what a respectable woman's hair ought to look like. Yet standing there in the doorway looking at a young woman who seemed entirely comfortable with a choice that would once have attracted considerable attention, Charlotte began to wonder whether the difference between their generations lay less in the hairstyle itself than in everything that hairstyle had come to represent. But that particular reaction passed rather more quickly than she expected. Watching her granddaughter move through the house afterward, hands-free of endless pins, headlight, and unburdened in a way Charlotte's own had rarely been permitted to feel, running rather than walking down the very same staircase Charlotte herself had once descended so carefully, weighed down by an hour of pins and padding, she found herself, rather to her own surprise, considerably closer to envy than disapproval. She asked eventually whether it had hurt watching that first cut fall to the floor, and her granddaughter had simply laughed, truly puzzled by the question, Unable to imagine why anyone would grieve over something so easily, so happily let go of, Agnes had passed on by then some years earlier, quietly in a small cottage on the edge of the very same estate where she had spent most of her working life, a modest pension arranged for her in her final years by a household that had by then come to understand rather better than it once had exactly what her decades of quiet, skilled labour had actually been worth. Charlotte visited her often in those last years, and the two of them freed finally from the old formalities neither had ever quite managed to set aside during all their working years together, spoke rather more plainly and rather more warmly than they ever had standing in front of that old familiar mirror. Agnes kept her own hair short by then too. She confessed with a small satisfied laugh during one of those final visits, having decided somewhere in her own later years that 30 years of caring for someone else's crowning glory had earned her the right to stop worrying quite so carefully over her own. She left Charlotte among a few small personal items, one carefully wrapped bundle Charlotte did not open until several weeks after the funeral, sitting alone in her own quiet room. Inside sat a small, neatly braided switch, the very same one, judging from its colour, Agnes had once made from Charlotte's own gathered combings. All those decades earlier, kept safely all this time, rather than ever actually put to use, a quiet keepsake from one woman's own crowning glory, saved by the very hands that has spent a lifetime tending it. And perhaps that small bundle offers the most fitting place to look back on everything that had filled those countless mornings before the mirror. Caring for a Victorian woman's hair was never simply a matter of brushing it, arranging it and fastening it into place. Around those familiar routines gathered changing fashions, household customs, old beliefs, new products, skilled work, and an entire trade in hair that connected women who would never meet one another. The dressing table became in its own quiet way a place where private habits met the wider world, and behind so many of those routines stood practiced hands like Agnes's, repeating tasks learned over years until something complicated appeared almost effortless. A single strand of hair, it turns out, was never really just a single strand of hair. It was economics, religion, class, labour, love and loss, all braided together so tightly that separating one thread from another proves considerably harder than separating any of Agnes's own carefully drawn switches ever was. Charlotte's crowning glory, and Nell's and Louisa's, and Agnes's own simple morning plait, all turned out to be telling essentially the very same story from remarkably different angles, a story about what a society asks of its women, and what those women in turn quietly ask of each other and of themselves, simply to get through an ordinary morning, looking, feeling and believing themselves ready to face whatever the day happened to hold. We still carry pieces of this same story today, more than most of us probably realize before tonight. We still brush our hair before bed without always knowing why the habit persists. We still worry over grey reach for bottles promising more than they can honestly deliver, trust labels. We have no real way of verifying ourselves. We still keep a child's first curl tucked away in a drawer, still feel something shift inside us the first time we cut it short. After wearing it long for years, still rely on hands other than our own, a hairdresser, a partner, a friend, leaning in with scissors at the kitchen table to help us look after this strange, stubborn, deeply personal part of ourselves we can never quite manage entirely alone. Every single time you sit down in a salon chair or ask someone you trust to help with a colour, you cannot quite reach yourself. You're taking part in something considerably older and considerably more human than any of us tend to give it credit for in the moment. If tonight's story kept you company while the rest of the world went quiet around you, I could not be more grateful you chose to spend this particular hour here with me. Thank you truly for staying all the way through Charlotte's long and rather remarkable life, for sitting with Agnes's quiet, patient skill, for letting Louisa and Nell and all the other women tucked inside this story earn a small permanent place in your own memory tonight. There is always another story waiting just past the edge of this one, another candlelit room, another quiet corner of history worth stepping into together. Until then, sleep well, rest easy, and I will see you again very soon.